I can share the screen.
I will take care of that.
Sounds good.
But before you jump in, Vinny, I want to brag about my mouse pad that's up on the screen right now. I'm not sure if everybody notices. I'm sure that Vinny has. This is actually the mouse pad that I have at in my home office at my desk, and this is an original Temecula Blind Pig Brewing Company from Temecula, and mouse pad. So pretty proud of that. All right, so let me see.
There, I got it now. I got the screen.
Good.
So let me take it. All right, just want to confirm, are you seeing the presentation on your screen?
Yes, we're also seeing your slides on the left. So if you want to go to...
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I forgot about this. Tell me, you remember how to change it to one? I can't remember.
Down in the lower right corner, right next to the magnification, there's a little icon, that one.
That's it.
Did that do it? Yeah, I went through this before when I just did one recently, but I don't remember the specifics.
Okay, well, you should be able to...
That should be it, but I didn't see it.
Doesn't seem to be working.
Up at the top, there's the thing, it says hide slide. Does that work?
No, that's not hide.
Below slideshow where it says hide slide.
Oh, yeah, that's just that one slide.
Sometimes there's a glitch where you have to put it into presenter you have to start presenting before you share. Occasionally that happens. So maybe if you stop sharing and then put it into presenter view before you share.
That sounds like a good suggestion.
Let's see.
It doesn't always happen, but occasionally it does.
Oh yeah, he was making it. I didn't have it. Yeah.
So I'm gonna stop share, and then
present slide or present something like that, whatever you see there.
Give me 1 second. All right. Yeah, it's tripping out because I've got dual monitors here at the at our house. So let's try it one more time, but let's try that. Is that still the same?
No,
that's better. You got it.
All right, I just had to pick the second monitor. I know how to make beer. I suck at this stuff. So all right, cool. Well, let's not like cheer and hooray about this just quite yet. We'll make sure I can move forward to the next next slide.
Vinny, we all have to play to our strengths, right?
Yeah. I'm just dangerous enough on computers to know what I'm doing, and then I just screw stuff up. And what's amazing is I used to be our IT person at the brewery, which I don't know how I ended up with that hat, but thankfully we have a real IT person now. So anyways, thanks for having me. Appreciate you asking me to be here. So when did Charlie speak to you guys? Last month?
Yep, just a month ago.
Jesus, those are big shoes to fill. I grew up making beer on his book, I think newer brewers nowadays would say like John Palmer's book would be the book, but for me it was the complete joy of homebrewing, and that thing was like a Bible. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Vinny, John Palmer presented for us too.
Yeah, so there you go. Now you're just making me nervous. So. anyways, well, anyways, yeah. So I know the original topic name was like history of West Coast IPA, but I've kind of diverted a little bit, and I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach, and I'll get into that in a couple slides, and then I'm going to finish with just a lot of things that we've learned, particularly in the last few years about making IPA. Some of them are relevant to homebrewers. Some of them may just be interesting, facts for you all to see what a commercial brewer has to go through and deal with. Things like hop creep and storage temperature of hops and how that affects the hops, and in some cases these are things that as a home brewer it's actually easier for you to correct if you're not doing them already. In other cases it may be not quite as easy. So anyways, so now did that move the slide?
Yes.
All right, I think we're good. So, all right. So who came first? This wouldn't have mattered if you were a San Diego homebrew club or someone on the East Coast. The origin of West Coast IPA did start on the West Coast, obviously. I remember back, and this would have happened in the probably like 2008 through 2015, 16 at the Great American Beer Festival. And for the IPA category, granted, there was no hazy IPA, there wasn't any of that. There was pale ale and IPA, and then eventually double IPA came along. But there wasn't strong pale ale, strong hazy, but you could count on the Pacific section, which encompassed Pizza Port. And over the years, of course, they grew. It encompassed Stone, ourselves, just fill in the blank, breweries. And you could just count on that Pacific section always winning the IPA category for the most part. I mean, it was almost like just commonplace. Paul Gatza from the Brewers Association used to call our aisle, he called it Murderer's Way. And I asked him one day, I'm like, what did you mean by that? And he goes, because you just murder our palates. Like the hop in flavor is just so intense that comes out of this little section of GABF. It's my favorite place to be. So anyway, but when I look back, and this is from my eyes, I think back to Rubicon, which unfortunately is no longer. They're in Sacramento. They made just a amazing IPA, and that was just basic Chinook, Cascade, or maybe Centennial and Cascade, Centennial, maybe Columbus. I don't remember the specifics, but that was my first introduction to a West Coast IPA. And I would come up to Northern California and take classes at UC Davis, and I would take a day, go to Rubicon, and just spend as much time there as I can drinking their IPA. Oftentimes I'd get a hotel nearby that was walking distance to be able to drink their beer. So that was a big deal for me. Solana Beach, Pizza Port, the Swamis was the first entry, I think, in the West Coast IPA down in Southern California. That predated Blind Pig, and I owe Vince. I still always tip my hat at Vince Marsaglia for helping me extrapolate my recipe up from my homebrew Blind Pig IPA recipe to a commercial batch. And then I opened Blind Pig in 1994, and many of you have maybe have you heard this story, but I knew Vince and Gina just through being a customer at Pizza Port and driving down there whenever I could from Temecula. And one day I called Vince and I said, hey, I'm opening a brewery. And I think Vince had my homebrew before. I said, can you help me extrapolate the recipe up from my IPA? And he goes, well, it'd be easier. Let me just give you the Swami's recipe. And I know you're not going to copy it because you have your own recipe. So he just gave me the Swami's recipe, and I used it as a guide to extrapolate up the Blind Pig IPA recipe. And then I created the inaugural ale double IPA. That was how I got started. And back then you couldn't give IPA away. It was, it was such a difficult beer to sell. And, people would say things like, it's like licking the rust off a tin can. And you have to think about it too, back then, the IPAs were in a lot of cases a lot more bitter than they are now, because commercial breweries have now backed off on bitterness and they're more hop flavor and hop aroma forward. But I'm going to contest that of who came first and say it's really the hop breeders that came before the brewers. And if any of you know a little bit about hop breeding, you know that it takes 10 to 12 years for a hop to come out. And so the names that I just pulled up on the screen are hop breeders that maybe who Jason Peralt is, because Jason, as I like to call him, is the Michael Jordan of hop breeders. He had his hand in Citra. He bred Mosaic, Atanum, Equinaut, Warrior, Citra. He has his hands in like some of the top bred, more recent IPA hops. So, but these other guys are some early, some recent. John Henning, someone I'm actually working with right now through the Hop Quality Group on a hop breeding program. Gene Pravasco was Jason's cohort before he retired. Chuck Zimmerman was Jason's mentor and predecessor. Al Hanold and S.T. Kenny, those guys were early on public breeding with Chuck Zimmerman through the USDA. And those guys touched Galena, Nugget, Chinook, Centennial, Cascade. I mean, you're talking, these are guys are the older generation of hop breeders, but without hop breeders, you don't have IPA, and you don't have West Coast IPA, and now more recently you don't have hazy, juicy IPA. So I'm going to kind of approach the subject tonight less about the breweries per se, and I may pepper some different brewery names in, and I'm going to look at it more of just kind of the lineage and the timeline of hops and how they came along, and how the timing of these hop varieties really helped trigger the IPA revolution. And sure, you need to have breweries that are willing to make these beers, and you need to have customers that are willing to drink these beers. But again, there's that old saying, what came first, the chicken or the egg? But here you don't have the ability to brew IPAs if you don't have the hops themselves, and the consumer doesn't have the ability to drink the amazing selection of IPAs that we have now if you don't have the hops. So when I started homebrewing in 1989, I homebrewed first down in San Diego, and these were, I mean, okay, there were more hops available, but these were the hops if we're just focusing on American West Coast, big hop flavors. We're not looking at English, like Kent Goldings, Fuggles, anything like that. I'm just looking at hops that are really impactful. This is really all it was. And Brewer's Gold is in there, and you'll understand why in a minute, because Brewer's Gold is a very, very, very important hop in the world of hop breeding, and most people don't know it, and it's the most underrated hop. And back in the day, because it did start out being bred in England, they would call some of the flavors that would come from Brewer's Gold in later years as American, meaning there was a more aggressive flavor. Cluster is probably the most American hop there is, and yet they don't know where it came from. California Cluster was a specific variety that was growing all up and down California. So Galena, Cascade, Comet. Comet's a hop that a lot of brewers, home brewers, and commercial brewers think is a new variety, but Comet actually came out just after Cascade, and then all of the Comet was ripped out. And it wasn't until about maybe 12 years ago that Reggie Brulat at Brulat Farms, she approached myself and Tom Nielsen at Sierra Nevada and a couple other breweries, and they started bringing back these old kind of heritage heirloom varieties, and Comet was one of them. And Comet was actually bred originally for Anheuser-Busch to be a bittering hop, and it was going to be a high alpha bittering hop at about 10 alpha acid, which back then was pretty high. And Anheuser-Busch rejected it because it had too much of a floral citrus-like flavor, and so it got removed And so it was out there for a while, and I remember homebrewing with it. But when I when I was, it didn't resurface until, like I said, maybe 10 years ago, or maybe a little longer. Nugget, Chinook, and then these two experimentals, CFJ90 and CFJ4. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of these, but they were hops that that I found at a homebrew shop down in El Cajon called Beer and Wine Craft. And I never knew about what an experimental hop was. The C, the F, and the J actually stand for the three breeders. You saw Chuck Zimmerman on the previous slide. Well, the C stands for Chuck. So what did these hops become? Well, CFJ4 unfortunately just went away. Never knew what happened to it. The only other person that I know that knows what CFJ4, that even remembers it, is Steve Dressler, the former brewmaster, retired brewmaster of Sierra Nevada, and Ken Grossman at Sierra. Those are the only two people I know that even remember it, and a couple of hop people up in Yakima. So, what did I should go back and say, so what did CFJ90 become? It became Centennial. So Centennial didn't get released until 1989. And I'll get back to the IPA hops, but I mentioned Brewer's Gold. Brewer's Gold has such an important lineage, or it's such an important hop. This isn't even the complete list. This is all I could find. Now, granted, some of these are like distant relatives to Brewer's Gold. Like, for instance, Magnum. Magnum was bred from Galena, but Galena was bred from Brewer's Gold and some other male. So Brewer's Gold goes back to a lot of English hops. But then all these other hops that it touched that you can still get today, Centennial, Nugget, Galena, Northern Brewer, and some of those hops at the top of the list aren't available anymore. Interestingly, Northern Brewer is bred from Brewer's Gold, and this male OY1 that is from California, but specifically its lineage is from the Sonoma County, where we're at, in Mendocino area. So you think of Mendocino, Hopland, and in Sonoma County, we were one of the largest hop growing regions in the United States and the world, actually, for that matter, at the time. And the original hop picking machine, the down hour, was invented right here in Santa Rosa in 1959, 1960. So we have this huge, great hop history. So Brewer's Gold's a hop that, although it's not used that much, we still use it because I just try to use enough to keep it alive. It's not a hop that is too common, but I challenge you to grab some and use it. Like I said, it was often characterized as being American, meaning that it had bigger, bolder flavors than English and German and Czech hops. And it actually, it's a really nice clean bittering hop, and does, often it's talked about as being catty, so being a little bit aggressive in flavor, but compared to the hops today, it's actually pretty pedestrian. So again, I started homebrewing in '89. These were the hops that I kind of focused on. Was Galena, Cascade, Comet, Nugget, Chinook, Centennial, and Tomahawk had just come out. So again, you saw the CFJ90 in '89, and then the next year it got commercialized. The Centennial did, and then Tomahawk, or also called Columbus, also called Zeus. Those were varieties that I could get my hands on. So in 1994, I start Blind Pig Brewery in Temecula, and these are some pictures. That's a couple of my friends who helped me build the brewery. Notice on the left picture, on the very left side, you see a 6-pack of Sierra Nevada Pale Ale, that like classic green Sierra Nevada 6-pack. So I've always been a huge Sierra Pale Ale fan, and it's always in my fridge. And still a pretty legendary beer. So this brewery was, I built it with my friends, bought used equipment from a guy in Bisbee, Arizona named Electric Dave, who unfortunately was doing time for selling marijuana mail order. That's a true story. And I bought the equipment from him while he was in jail. So it was pretty pieced together. Plastic fermenters, as you can see, the kettle that's straightforward in the right picture and the bottom picture. That was an old soup tank from a military base. That was the mash tun on the right that Dave is leaning against. So pretty much cobbled together, but actually made some pretty rockin' beer. So there's Natalie after the mash in of the first brew of the inaugural ale. That's the famous first double IPA. And then the picture on the right is me running the beer through the filter, first batch, and a couple Grundy tanks behind. Soon thereafter, we stopped filtering and just used fining agents. So really got to Blind Pig, I didn't focus on all these hops, but I'm leaving Comet in there because it has made a comeback, and Crystal had just been released, but it hadn't been, it wasn't really easy to get. So I was focusing on Cascade, Chinook, Centennial, and Tomahawk, or Columbus as it was called back then, or CTZ for short. And I bring up Crystal beer hop because it does have like some Hallertau lineage bred into it. But if you use it and get it from the right farm, it actually it has this amazing grapefruit quality to it. And it's low alpha compared to all the other newer hops that you get today that typically aren't low alpha anymore. So I'm a big Crystal fan, and it'll show up later on in the presentation. So this is what the malt bill and hops look like, and kind of dry hop rates and whatnot. I was doing cold dry hopping because those plastic fermenters were basically like an open top fermenter, but that was it. You know, when you hear brewers talk about the 4 C's, that's it: Chinook, Cascade, Centennial, Columbus, and it was the same malts and same hops for both our regular IPA and our double IPA, and then subsequent our anniversary beer, which was a double IPA. The dry hop rates on regular Blind Pig, 3/4 of a pound to a pound. It's actually pretty impressive for the time. Now that would be considered pedestrian. So after a few years, I sold my part in Blind Pig. My former partners kept the brewery going. Corbel Champagne Cellars was opening a brewery, and so I found out about it. Long story short, they hired me. And still, you couldn't give away IPA, and we didn't even open Russian River Brewery with an IPA. And if you look at this list, it's still the same hops, other than there's one new variety, a tannum, that is added to what I would call IPA hops. And yes, you could use Galena Nugget in there, but it's not something that I specifically focused on. And so I'm not necessarily including all the hops, but pretty much the main ones that I thought were IPA focused. And so Corbel, we finally make an IPA, and but along the way, we make this beer called Hop to It. I started that pretty early, and it's a single hop beer. And when I started out, and so it's the same malt bill, the same yeast, the same water profile. I'm going to go backwards. The dry hop quantity was always the same. The Whirlpool edition was always the same. The mid-boil edition was the same. The only thing that changed was the quantity of hops in the bittering edition and the variety itself. And that bittering hop edition would change because the alpha acid would, of course, fluctuate. But we'd always try to hit the same BUs. So that was, like, for me, the single best way to learn about all these hop varieties. So I went back and found every old variety I could brew with: Bromley Cross, Bullion, Eroica, and then worked my way through to more modern hops at the time. But in between, stopped at, hops like Cascade, Centennial, Nugget, everything that I've talked about. And it really gave me a foundation for what a hop can do, and really learn, like, oh, this one's good for bittering, this one isn't, this one has better flavor impact, and so on and so forth. So that was something that we started doing then, and we still make Hop to It to this day. And it's a really important part of our program. We now have a little pilot brewery, a 5-barrel pilot brewery that we can test hops out on if we don't have huge quantities. So I start making IPA at Corbel, and like you saw the slide before in 1990.
I think we may have lost Vinny, at least the video feed.
I think Dan killed it with that cough.
It almost sounded like we lost Vinny.
I can see the slides, but can't hear him.
Are you trying to build suspense here?
Yeah, I think Dan killed him with that cough. I think that's what did it.
I thought I was muted.
Got the digital Rona.
I thought that was a dog barking for a second.
I just started to feel like I was in the wrong room and I'm seeing things I shouldn't see. It's great.
I think Corbel did it.
Yeah, I think he'll be right back in. I hope.
I have a story about Blind Pig Brewery. Jack Ridley and I wandered around Temecula for 2 hours on a Friday night in like 1994 or 95, whenever, right shortly after the brewery opened. And we never found it. We went all over looking. We were on a mission and we never found the brewery until the next day. We ran in a 10K and ate at a pancake breakfast and ran into a guy with the Blind Pig sweatshirt. So he told us where the brewery was, and we had driven past it like twice the night before, and it was in an industrial park. We were looking for like a brew pub place, so we completely missed it. So just down and Jack being stupid again, nothing new there.
Yeah, I think we stopped running, didn't we? And we pounded on the door till they let us in.
Yeah. And we talked to Vinny was there and he gave us a little brief tour, and we bought a growler, and then we went back to the hotel and drank it, and we realized we should have brought more than one growler.
Great story, Don. Thanks.
You didn't finish the run though after you had that growler?
We had already done the run.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Well,
Even better, a good story. Good, Jack.
Yeah, we did good. We did good.
We
Nice.
were at his,
Kind of an extension.
24
oh, okay, 24 years. Long time.
next month.
Yeah.
Are you from the East Coast too?
No, I'm from Southern California.
Chris is, LA girl.
Yep.
Our presenter dropped his internet cracked out.
What?
Vinny dropped
Oh,
out.
no.
He's gone. It's funny. Somebody coughed. It sounded like they shot him, and he went away.
It was Dan. We're gonna point the finger at Dan. I saw him. Come on, Dan, fess up.
Has anybody called Vinny to let him know that he's not talking to anybody right now?
Oh,
I'm trying to call him right now.
So in the meantime, we were up at his family's winery, and my wife will finish the story because
Well, so his parents gave us a little card with directions on how to find the brewery, and yeah, that's how we went the first time, was from the winery.
it was like 5 minutes before they closed, and we're like, "Oh no, you're closed." I was like, "We're sorry." It's like, "No, come in, please."
Drink beer, it's
Like,
great.
well, I've been drinking wine all day, but all right.
North County is so much more populated.
You know, I mean, after a long day of wine drinking, there's nothing that cuts through all that winey stuff than a good, nice West Coast IPA.
Except for having drive back from Temecula after a day of wine drinking back to Orange County.
Ooh, that's a little rough. You're right.
Back when the 76 wasn't 2 lanes in each direction all the way through like it is now.
Yeah,
I'm glad to see that Vinny was validating the hops that I used to really like to brew with. All the C hops, the Chinook, Cascade, Centennial, Columbus. Andy always said Columbus was the most underrated hop, and I totally agree with that. That was always a really good one. But I think they're still classics. I mean, I taste IPAs now, and I like the ones that have the old C hops in them the best.
Vinny is rebooting his router. He had a system failure, so he's trying to rejoin us as quickly as he can after he reboots.
I think even just saying the C hops dates you as a brewer.
It does. I'm an old guy brewer. I love my C hops, and I absolutely love Chinook. I mean, that was always the heavy arsenal of the C hops. If you really wanted to get a twang to your beer, you'd throw in a little bit, or in my case, way too much Chinook, and you always got a nice twang from it.
I got to give Don credit for probably helping to develop the double, triple IPA, a super hopped. It was like 5, big time. He would always overdo it. I say, stop doing that. He'd reach around, grab a handful of hops, and more is better. More is better. So Don was way ahead of his time.
I was the first barley engineer to put over a pound of hops in a 5-gallon batch. I was really 20 years ahead of my time for sure. And they were all terrible batches because they were, not brewed very well, but they were a little grassy.
Yeah, Don, do you still have that video of us brewing in your kitchen?
I do, but it's a VHS tape, brewing with Don and Jack, but I don't have a VHS player. But if I ever get one, I could play maybe I might have digitized it. In fact, I'm almost sure I digitized it. I'll see if I can dig it up.
That would be so fun to see. I'd like to see myself with some hair, number one, and and then go back to the early days and see how smart we really were. People didn't appreciate it.
Well, the key takeaway from that video we made, Jack, was your magical yeast incantation. It was a German incantation that when you pitched your yeast and you stirred the wort vigorously, you had this magical incantation called stir the wort as you shook your carboy. And you tried to tell people if they didn't use the magical incantation, their beer would turn out horrible. And I think you were right.
That sounds like in Fantasia with the brooms and the water, having to haul the water with all the different brooms and stuff. That's crazy.
It works once, repeat it.
I think we're back, Vinny, aren't we?
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know what happened there.
Hey,
but,
that's good. No matter.
Anyways, sorry about that. Apologies. So, so where I was at. So anyways, I think I was saying that, back in the early days of the craft beer movement and homebrewing, like there weren't all these new designer, hops and whatnot. You pretty much had Cascade, Chinook, Centennial, Tomahawk, a couple other of hops to play with to make your beers. And so in 1998, 2000, things really changed because that's when you had Amarillo and Simcoe come out, and then also Nelson and then Warrior. Warrior isn't necessarily considered an IPA hop, but it's an amazing bittering hop. And I don't know how many of you use Warrior, but I absolutely love it for bittering because it's such a clean bitterness and it's quite high alpha acid. So when you're trying to get the most bang for your buck in an IPA, I always go for Warrior, and that works for both West Coast IPAs and hazy IPAs. Probably the most famous hazy IPA brewery out there is Treehouse in Massachusetts. And one of their favorite bittering hops is Warrior. So that's a hop that works both for hazy beers and kind of a cleaner West Coast. But for us, the game changer was Amarillo and Simcoe. And we really, that was a hop that we put focus on. Simcoe became the main hop in Pliny the Elder. I started peppering Amarillo through different beers. But like I was saying before I cut out there, this was the era of when private hops really started becoming a big part of it, of the hop scene and the IPA scene. And this is when you started to see IPAs start to make their gradual kind of incline in popularity. Granted, it would take another decade or longer for them to explode and they haven't gone away since. Nelson, it's hard to believe that it's been around that long. It was released the same time as Simcoe. But the thing is Nelson was from New Zealand, super small hop growing region. I mean, there's farms in Yakima that are bigger than almost all of New Zealand hop fields combined. And all the Nelson we were getting at the time in America, in all honesty, smelled like crap. It was onion garlic. It smelled like and tastes like cat pee. And there just wasn't anything redeeming about it, at least for me personally. So it's not a hop that I would touch until more recently. But it really, these new hop varieties were more impactful, and it was a real shift in the breeding programs in Yakima and the Northwest to these private varieties. So at Korbel, we had Russian River IPA and then eventually Pliny the Elder. Pretty simple malt bills, and using all the same malts between the two beers, just in different proportions. Hops, some crossover, some different, but Simcoe being the important hop for us. I think the one other thing to focus on this slide is the T45 pellets. And if some of you may not know it, the difference between a T90 and a T45. So a T90 pellet is the standard everyday pellet that you buy at your homebrew shop, or that we buy from most of our vendors. But a T45 is that same hop, but with a lot of the green matter removed, and so you get a higher concentration of everything: alpha acids, oils, and less green matter. And I'll come back to that later. And some of this may sound familiar to some of you all, because that's what cryo is, which is a concentrated hop pellet that Yakima Chief sells now. So eventually Korbel decides to get out of the beer business, and they offer the brewery to me. I basically buy the brand from them, or actually I trade my severance for that. I trade my severance for the name of the brewery, the beer names, a couple other oddball things. And now this is where we're at. We have all the same hop varieties available. So nothing has changed in 2004. And everything's the same. IPAs are starting to gain a little bit of traction in California, more so than anywhere else. Colorado a little bit, but not really. The Northwest to a degree, but the really big, full-bodied, full of hops IPAs were all coming from California, from Northern California to Southern California, and everywhere in between. What's interesting about this timeline is when you look at what did I note on Simcoe, is that I was using Simcoe in the late 90s as an experimental, when it was called YCR 014, and then eventually it gets released as Simcoe. This really changed the three farms that own Simcoe: Loftus, Peralt, and Carpenter. These farms were struggling mightily, and it was Simcoe that, to some degree, saved all of these farms. These farms were having to sell off acres of land just to make it, and so the privatization of the breeding program in this case really did help them. But if you look at my note there, 2 years after it was released, there was 0 pounds of Simcoe harvested because no one was buying Simcoe. And then eventually, in a few years later, they're throwing out 50,000 pounds of Simcoe. That's hard to believe right now, because you could at least take those hops and convert them into pellets and make extract out of it. But the extract market was full. There wasn't any need for any more hop extract. So a hop like Simcoe in its day was almost a little too much ahead of its time. And one of the things that I'm personally most proud of is that you can kind of watch the trajectory of Pliny the Elder and Simcoe at the same time. And without Simcoe, we don't have Pliny, but Mike Smith from Loftus and Brad Carpenter and Jason Peralt will tell you that without Pliny, you don't have Simcoe. And so the two were really kind of a partner in growth. And as Pliny gained popularity, other brewers started to notice it. and take note. And it did also help propel the rest of their breeding program, because every pound of private hops that gets sold, a small portion of that dollar per pound amount is going back into the breeding program. But again, still no new hop varieties. So when we opened, Russian River reopened it, we had 3 IPAs, which was almost unheard of at the time, even in San Diego. But you can still see that other than Pliny, they were a lot of the same hop varieties, because there just wasn't much to else to pick from. But I really wanted to distinguish, differentiate the hops, and so like I didn't use Chinook in Pliny because I didn't want to have all the same hop characters through and through, and all the while Pliny was always very focused on Simcoe, and then with Amarillo behind it. So in 2008, we built a production brewery. For us, the big change was, or the big addition was a lab program, and that's our old lab tech Mike in the lab, and it was just this small room that I built out in that brewery. But little by little, we accumulated lab equipment to really put a focus on quality assurance and quality control. You know, as new hop varieties came out, we didn't have any room to play with them, because Pliny had become such a huge part of our production. So, I mean, look at this timeline from 2000, when you had Warrior, Simcoe, and Nelson. It was 8 years until the next main IPA hop came out, which was Citra, which, you know, as I can't remember who said it, but like Citra and Mosaic make it, you know, any monkey can brew an IPA with Citra and Mosaic is a funny line that someone said. But Citra was a game changer, because it really is the pinnacle of hop flavor. And this is now when you really see the public taking an interest in IPAs, and they're becoming easier and easier to sell. And it seems like every brewery is starting to make an IPA. We're not quite to the point where every brewery has 2 IPAs, but Citra is a game changer, and it grows really fast. Now look at the 2009, you have Galaxy. 2010, you have Eldorado. So now you're really getting into the heyday of IPA hops. And then you know, back to Russian River, we're not making Russian River IPA anymore, which was more of a crystal malt focused IPA. So it had definitely more of a reddish amber color to it. Whereas Blind Pig and Pliny, they always had crystal malt in them, but it was at like the 1 to 2, maybe 3% mark. So really, really small percentage, just enough crystal malt to give you sweetness. But also notice that there's carapils in these recipes, and have in previous slides as well. Carapils being an unfermentable dextrin malt to be able to give body and mouthfeel. This carapils will come to bite us in the ass in a few slides from now when we get to more present time. But here we release a new pale ale called Happy Hops. And Happy Hops is using this hop HBC 369, and it's dry hopped at a modest rate of 1 pound per barrel. When I started using it, I was given a bale of hops from Jason Peralt, who bred 369, and 369 becomes Jason's third kind of great hop breeding. A great hop that he had his hand in hop breeding, and 369 becomes Mosaic. So another like amazing IPA hop. So you look at from 2008 to 12, you've got Citra, Galaxy, Eldorado, and Mosaic. All have been released. All are just making it so much more easier. And these are like overly impactful hops that are so easy to get instant flavor out of. And all the while, more and more breweries are focusing on these hops. They're shying away from the older IPA varieties like Cascade, Chinook, Centennial. I always kept those in our mix because these hops are also quite expensive and still are quite expensive. And you guys probably see that as homebrewers as well. And you can have these other hops built into your recipes, and they're just like foundational hops. And then you can use some of them like Mosaic or Citra or whatnot to really be impactful. We use Citra. I was a late bloomer, but we don't use a lot of it. For us, it's just like a little bit here and a little bit there to add a little bit of nuance and what it is. You know, that to me is what's wrong with the IPA market right now in craft, is that the majority of hazy IPAs all taste the same because they're all using the same hop varieties. They're all using Citra, Mosaic, Eldorado, Galaxy, maybe Nelson here and there. So anyways, that's just my, I'll get off my soapbox. 2013, you finally have a public variety release that's IPA, and that's Cashmere. And I remember I mentioned earlier Reggie Burlot, who brought back some old varieties like Eroica and whatnot. She had this hop that she called Cascade Cross, and it was something, it was a publicly bred hop, but it didn't really have a name yet. And she gave me a bale or a quarter bale of it, whatever it was, and I started using it. It was just an absolute beautiful, beautiful hop, but no one was selling it. And so it was really hard to get our hands on it. And it was only because brewers started asking for it that the brokers started selling it. And it's a great variety with these just really nice citrus notes and clean notes, and I just love it for those flavors. And it's pretty accessible now too. And then in 2018 and 19, you have Sabro and now Talus have been released. Granted, there's been other varieties released in between all of this. There's been Lemon Drop and others from Steiner. But again, this is kind of from my vantage point, and with me making IPAs, I tended to be more connected with Hop Union and Yakima Chief, who a lot of these hops were connected with. Sabro, if some of you have used, it's a Neo-Mexicana hop, meaning that it has lineage from America. The rootstock was bred from America, and I believe its number was 438. And then its daughter is Talus, which was HBC 692. And I love Talus. It's got this absolutely amazing pink grapefruit quality to it. And it just got released last year. So you should start seeing it in the next couple years, that it should become more readily available. Sabro can be a little polarizing. It's got this over the top mint and almost overly tropical, like coconut, pina colada note to it. Talus has that in a much softer way, and has this pink grapefruit note that I just absolutely can't get enough of. So we in 2018 we opened built our dream brewery. We bought out all of our investors and built our dream brewery in Windsor, California, and really just incorporated everything that we had dreamt about in a brewery into the operation. You can see the brew house there. It's a 75 barrel brew house, open top fermenters, a cool ship, as you see on the upper right of the screen. The bottom left picture are a mix of 75 barrel, 150 barrel, and 300 barrel fermenters, so singles, double, and quads. The middle picture on the bottom row is the basement below the open top fermenter. So that's the open top fermenters above, with the yeast collectors that the yeast can billow out into, and then our barrel room as well, which we have maybe, I don't know, 800 or 900 wine barrels in our funky brewery. So we really, we're thinking about everything that we do: sour beers, Belgian beers, some lagers that we do now, STS Pills and Velvet Glow, but obviously IPA is what pays the electric bill. And so as we move forward through the different parts of the operation and what have you, we really were looking at Actually, before I move on to some of the more technical stuff, I wanted to show you where the IPAs have moved to now. So Blind Pig IPA now, notice that there's no crystal malt in it. We've switched to Munich malt, and over the years we've learned that crystal malt can be through the roasting process of the crystal malts, you can end up with some oxidation issues. And that's from the heat stress that's put on the malt when it goes through the roasting process. And then if you go down, we never used it in Happy Hops, but Pliny the Elder, you'll see the same thing. So we've switched from a crystal like 30 or 40 to a Munich 30 to get our color. We've also switched from our base malt from our regular standard 2-row to a higher color 2-row. And that flavor profile, that allows us to get more color from our base malt without needing to rely on specialty malts. We've also increased the hops that have gone into these beers. You see crystal in there. You see a little bit of Citra in there. I mean, Citra is such a nice hop because just even a tiny percentage will give you a real strong accent of citrus and whatnot. Happy Hops became an IPA, still with a focus on Mosaic, but a lot of other hops peppered in. And you'll see Pliny, it's still heavily focused on Simcoe. It's bittered with Warrior, lots of Amarillo. It still has Cascade and Centennial. We've dropped Tomahawk out of that recipe as we have of Blind Pig because of the potential oxidative notes that Tomahawk can contribute. It's been studied at some point along the way that CTZ potentially have some more metals in the hop. So and so those metals can be oxidizers like iron and manganese, that sort of thing. So although the makeup of the hops of our beers have changed a little bit, the foundation of these recipes haven't changed. But what has changed is the dry hop quantities have gone up. Blind Pig is still at 1 pound per barrel. Pliny is up to 2 pounds per barrel. And I often get asked, like, well, how has Pliny stayed so relevant? And I think a part of it is that we have kind of changed with the times as IPA drinkers have wanted a drier, more less crystal malt, a little cleaner flavor. We've made small shifts to the recipe while still trying to keep the color about the same, still keeping the alcohol, the dryness, and that same strong pine, grapefruit, and slightly pungent quality that Simcoe gives. So the Happy Hops now represents what I would call like a progressive IPA, and that's where most IPAs are at, where they're very focused on aroma and flavor and less about bitterness. And I still love a firm bitterness in my beer and my IPA. And I've often say that there's a bit of an assault on bitterness right now in beer and in IPA. And a lot of times IPA can be a little flabby these days and a little clumsy because it just doesn't have that snappiness on the finish of your palate. And if you happen to be experiencing that with your beer, it might just be that you need to up your bittering hops just a little bit. So so kind of getting into some of the details of what we do at the brewery, kind of just to focus on quality and things that we do to make better IPA. So it all starts in the lab. So that's the left picture is our main lab. And I won't go into details of everything that's in there, but a few of the highlights: we can measure yeast automatically, BUs, color, alcohol, gravity. And then our sensory lab is the middle picture. And that's a really, really important component it should be an important component of any brewery. And we put a heavy focus on our packaging lab, where we can check CO2, dissolved oxygen, total package oxygen. We can take a bottle and test it to make make sure that the crown seals properly. Now that we're canning, we have equipment that can test the can seal and make sure that those are proper. We have fill height inspection on our bottling line. We're about to install our own canning line. We'll put the same thing in. And then finally on the right is a sensory lab. And that's something that we've always done sensory, but now we do it in a very formal manner. We have an app called Draft Lab that allows all of our employees to have the app on their phone. They can type in whatever they're tasting in a beer into this app, and it just makes it really easy. So moving on, some of the things that I think about when I make IPA is let's start with the malt. Malt often gets forgotten when you are making an IPA. And I'm gonna actually go back a couple slides to Blind Pig. And if you look, you've got best pale malt. It's the second malt next to the 2-row. That was something I added into the to the Blind Pig recipe, and I think it was 2008. And what best pale is it's an English malt from Simpson malt from England, and it's and it's got just this full-bodied mouthfeel, but it's not like Maris Otter or Golden Promise to where it has this overly biscuity and bready quality. And so I was looking for a way to add body and mouthfeel to Blind Pig, but I didn't want to do it through Carapil's unfermentable malt. I wanted it to be a fermented malt, and I wanted to have fermentable sugars in it, obviously. But I wanted it to contribute fullness. And I started testing with Maris Otter, and it just left too much of a malt contribution to the beer. So I think that oftentimes, malt does get overlooked, but blending malts together to create that foundation for you to build a hop profile on can be really, really strategic, because if you're really trying to make a big and impactful beer in flavor, but maybe you don't want it to be super high in alcohol. Like that's why we don't use Best Pale in Pliny the Elder, but we use it in Blind Pig, because Blind Pig is a lower alcohol beer. Look to blend some English malts that have more full flavor. And really you need to have, malt that has been kilned at a slightly higher temperature, like an English or a pale ale malt has been, to say like 3.5, maybe even 4 Lavibond, or even using some Munich, low colored Munich malt. Those are ways to add a lot of depth and mouthfeel to your beer without letting it overtake the hops that you'll add in. Some of the things that we've done at the new brewery is we have this malt cleaning equipment. So that's the picture on the left. So all the malt that comes through, it can start in our silos, which is our base malt, the higher color 2-row malt. It could be a super sack, which you see there on the left picture, but on the right side, the big BSG bag, that's a 2,000 pound super sack. Or we can bag dump. Just to the left of that is our bag dump station. And so all that malt goes through this aspiration equipment where it's using vacuums and suction to pull out all the dust and the husk, and all that stuff ends up separated out. So we end up with a cleaner, more pure malt. And what's amazing is the destoner, the middle picture. That's a bucket full of stones that we've pulled out over the course of the 2.5 years that we've been in Windsor. It's hard to believe that there's that many rocks and pebbles in your malt. You almost never see it if you're just putting your hand through the bag of malt, but it's there. And that stuff going through your mill over time will destroy your rollers. We've also incorporated a wet mill into the brewery in Windsor. So a wet mill hydrates the malt. 50% of the mash water will hydrate the grain before it even gets crushed, and then the grains will go through the rollers. And because it's moist, it'll actually have a more gentle crack, and it'll leave the husk more intact. And then the other 50% of the mash water will get injected into the crushed grain on its way to the mash tun. And then instead of dropping into the top of the mash tun like most mash tuns are, it actually gets pumped in the bottom through a progressive cavity pump. So all these little details to have less oxidation, less splashing. Even this early on in the mashing process, we're thinking about oxidation and thermal stress. And so this wet mill, obviously it's not something you can get as a home brewer, but on a professional level, it's just one of those small details that we opted to go with, along with the malt cleaning, to end up with a cleaner, less grainy. There's less husk and dust and whatnot that's going into the lauter tun. The husk is where a lot of polyphenols are. For me personally, I like hop polyphenols, but I don't necessarily want malt polyphenols. Whoops. And so, so now let's looking at hops. So at our old brewery, at our old production brewery, our freezer or our hop cold box was also where we stored the beer. And it would often, I thought it was 38 degrees, but most breweries, they're sharing their cold box with other operations. It might be the kitchen, it might be where they have their servers, where they're cleaning the tanks, and that temperature is fluctuating. So one of the big things we did was focus on hop storage. And so we have two 25-degree Fahrenheit hop freezers. And this is one of those things, like I said at the beginning, if you can, if you can, as a home brewer, there are things that you can do better than professional brewers. I would bet that 99% of the small breweries out there in America don't have freezers to store their hops in. And that's something that you as a home brewer have an advantage of because you're buying smaller quantities. If you're not storing your hops in your freezer, whether you've just bought them or whether you've opened the bag and you're about to, and you're going to reuse them, or you've just sealed them up to put them away, always store your hops in the freezer. Super, super important. Something else we added that, again, you as a home brewer have an advantage of, and that's the middle and the right picture, and that's of our hop back. And this is basically a lauter tun, but for hops, but with the screens on the side. So if you look at the picture on the right, these are basically lauter tun screens going around the edge of the vessel, and then the bottom is open because that's a slide gate, and that's how we discharge all the spent hops into the basement. So that middle picture is a partial picture of our brew house, and that's sitting over a 16-foot basement. So all the guts and all the operations of the brew house happen underneath. And so we used to be 100% pellet brewery, and one of the things that we added in for the new brewery was this hop back to be able to allow us to use whole cone hops. Again, something that home brewers can more easily do compared to most professional brewers are only set up to use pellets. And so how we use this is our hop back. If all of you know what a torpedo is, how Sierra Nevada dry hops their beers, it's an external device that they put all the whole cone hops in, and then they pump the beer through it. And here, it's set up the same way, except it's on the hot side. So we can dump these bucketfuls of hops up to 100, 150 pounds into the hop back. And then we can pump wort from the kettle, go over the top of the hops, and then pump it back to the kettle. So we can do this recirculation, or we can go from the kettle to the hop back to the whirlpool. If we wanted, we could go whirlpool, hop back, whirlpool. It's not something we do. It just happens to work. But how we mostly use this is we no longer, in most of our beers, make a quote unquote whirlpool addition. So we're not adding pellets to the whirlpool, or in the case of a home brewer, you would turn your flame off, you would add your pellets, maybe you whirlpool with a paddle, maybe just let it settle, whatever you do. So we don't add that hop addition anymore. We pump the wort from the kettle to the whirlpool. It goes in through the side tangentially, so it spins. It sits there for 20 minutes while all the proteins and trub and whatnot settle out. And all the while, our brewers have loaded the hop back full of the whole cone hops. And when we're about ready to knock out and cool our wort down, we'll pump from the whirlpool through the hop back over the top of this bed of hops The nice thing here too is the hops act as a filter aid as well. So we have cleaner wort also. So for those of you that have never homebrewed with whole cone hops, one of the great advantages of whole cone hops is that you tend to have much cleaner wort because the whole cone hops act as a filter bed. And then the wort exits, it goes down to a pump, and that pump immediately pumps that hot wort that's just gone through that bed of hops. It goes immediately to the wort cooler and cools the wort down. So what we've done is we've captured all those super volatile and delicate hop oils that typically get lost. Because if you think about a professional or a home brewer, when you make that that Whirlpool Hop Edition charged with pellets, let's talk about a typical craft brewery. You end your boil, you dump your Whirlpool hops in. You typically let your wort sit for 5 minutes to stop mixing, vortexing from the boil. You'll run your Whirlpool for say 5 minutes. You'll then let it sit for 20 minutes to let all the hops and trub get compacted into the middle of the vessel. So now we're 30 minutes in. At best, you can knock out in 30 minutes, and most breweries are 40 minutes to an hour. But let's say you have an amazing setup. You're now an hour in. So the very last bit of wort that has gone through that wort cooler has now been in contact with 200, 205 degree hop pellets, and you are isomerizing at that temperature. So you're making your beer more bitter and more bitter. And all the while, all those delicate hop oils and aromas are volatilizing off. And so that's why we installed the hop back. And this is something that homebrewers can pretty easily accomplish and can do and kind of match what we're doing. So in doing this, we actually lost a lot of BUs because we didn't have the pellets sitting in the kettle or in the Whirlpool all that time. So we had to add more hops on the front end, Warrior hops for say Pliny, but we gained a much more beautiful and what I think is just a more appropriate aroma. It's cleaner. I just love everything we get from this hop back. So some other things that we're really focused on these days. So thiols are something that the wine industry has talked about for years, specifically in Sauvignon Blanc, that kind of grassy, sometimes a little cat pee like quality is a thiol, and it's not something that's typically reported on a on say, like if you pull up some website and you're reading about hops, it typically won't talk about thiols. You kind of need to do some research and dig into it. But you have these compounds, 4-MMP, 3-MH, and they're that kind of Sauvignon Blanc wine grape quality like you get in Nelson, the tropical and some of the citrus notes you get out of Citra and Mosaic and Simcoe. Sriracha Ace is another hop that has some thiols. And the unique things, and thiols are sulfur compounds, and we always think of sulfur as being bad. You know, you think of DMS on the malt side, dimethyl sulfate, that's bad. You think of onion garlic, like hops that are over kilned or picked too late, are as we say in the industry as OG or onion garlic. So there again, that's a sulfur compound, not positive, but there are positive thiols that are measured in the parts per trillion, and the impact of some of these hop compounds that are thiols can be more impactful at a minute amount compared to other compounds in the hops, because they are so flavor active. And so if you have not done any research on thiols, I strongly recommend you look at them, look for varieties that are thiol rich, and I mentioned Citra and Simcoe and Mosaic, and there's others as well. So that's something that is definitely kind of new into the beer world. Not something that was really talked about much even 5 years ago, surprising. Something that a lot of breweries have been doing for say a decade now is mixing their dry hops. And as most small breweries have to do this by way of a pump or bubbling CO2 through the bottom of their tank to burst CO2 through to push the hops back up to get more contact time, and then they'll settle back through. Or they'll connect a pump to the bottom of their tank into one of the side valves and recirculate it. I've never liked that concept because on the professional level, on the big scale, if you're potentially introducing oxygen into the operation, if your pump happens to have a leak, you can have the Venturi effect where you're sucking air in and you're oxidizing your beer. It just always left me very unsettled if you didn't have a really strong maintenance program to make sure that your pump seals were always in tip-top shape. I never liked the idea of bubbling CO2 through, because as you're jacking through CO2 through the bottom of your tank, you're also stripping out some of the hop oils that you extracted from those early hops. And so it always seemed a little counterintuitive to me. As a home brewer, if you're fermenting in a carboy or a small vessel, you can easily just shake the vessel and by hand and resuspend the hops. You will get a quicker extraction of oils. You'll also potentially extract some more polyphenols, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I like a high polyphenol count. And you'll also speed up the hop creep, and which I'll talk about here in a minute. So what we did at our new Windsor brewery, was we designed this port into the back side of all of our tanks, which we can attach this portable tank mixer, which is up on the screen. That's called a Guth. It's pretty standard in the wine industry. So we have a ball valve attached to the cone of every one of our tanks, and then the Guth mixer is portable and it sits on the stand. And the rod that has the impeller that's now inside the tank, this is the back side of it, and it actually retracts and you can pull it out. And so our brewers will roll the stand up while that ball valve is closed. They'll attach it, and then the rod with the impeller on the end is sanitized, and then they'll open the ball valve, they'll push it in, and then they'll turn it on, and we'll mix our tanks for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. And that gets all the hops homogenized within the tank within an hour. And it starts that extraction process. Some breweries have noted that they've been able to reduce their hop load by as much as 20% by mixing their hops and their dry hop when they're dry hopping. And so it's something from a flavor impact, but like I said, it also helps speed up hop creep, which I'll talk about in a minute. Something else that we started doing probably 2 years ago is a cone dump. So after we add the dry hops, we will only leave the dry hops on the beer for 48 to 72 hours. By that time, the hops have settled through and they are now in the cone of our tank. Now, if you're fermenting in a carboy and you wanted to follow this process, you would have to rack the beer off the hops to another carboy, and you would want to gas that secondary carboy with CO2 so that you're not introducing oxygen. If you're fermenting in a fancy cone bottom homebrew fermenter, which would be similar to the conical tanks we use, we'll burp the bottom of the tank to the drain or to our line that feeds out to our spent yeast and spent hops tank, and we'll get those hops off of the out of the beer. And the advantage here is that a lot of times you'll end up with flavor. I don't know if you can hear that, or my cats are behind me talking to me. So hey guys, go ahead. Sorry about that. So the advantage is that you can actually lose hop aroma by leaving your beer, your dry hopped beer, sitting on the hops too long. So if you have a way to get your beer off the dry hops after 48 to 72 hours, that is what you want to do, either by transfer to another vessel or by dumping the cone. And so that was something we saw a real big increase in our flavor profile of our hops, both in aroma and flavor of our IPAs when we started doing that. And for us, it was also, it also helped with hop creep, and a lot of things are relating back to hop creep, which is why it's the last item. Next on the list is dry hop load. Pounds per barrel is what we talk about in the beer industry. You'll often hear brewers talk about that, and I had it listed on some slides before. But the fact is that pounds per barrel of dry hop doesn't mean anything anymore, because there's all these other products out there, hop products out there. There's oils that you can add in. There's cryo hops, which would be T45 hops, which is the next line down. And so you've got T45s, which Yakima Chief has come up with the name cryo. And can you guys hear the cat back behind me? Hopefully not. So okay, all right, not too bad. So so the T45 cryo hops, I'm not sure if anyone's used them or not, but they are they're concentrated hops, and I used to use T45 years ago. And every hop company now has a version of T45, but they're concentrated hops, and so they've removed a lot of the green matter, and they end up being more true to type varietal. So if you use Simcoe, we make this beer Road 2 Hill 56, it's an all Simcoe beer. And if we make that with T90 pellets, which are standard regular pellets, and then if we made another batch with cryo Simcoe pellets, and you typically will use 50% less of a cryo or T45 hop compared to a T90 hop. And they do cost twice as much, but you end up with better yield because you have less dry hops going in, but you also end up with a cleaner, more true to type hop flavor. And I love what cryo and T45s do, and they are starting to become available to home brewers. And not every hop variety is available in cryo. It tends to be, or T45, it tends to be kind of some of the more main IPA varieties like Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe, Amarillo, that sort of thing. But if you haven't played around with them, super cool way to add hops. They look just like a regular hop pellet. And again, I'll go back to hop creep. It'll help reduce hop creep a little bit, which I will talk about in a minute. I think one of the most interesting things that I've learned over the last decade, and specifically from we have a hop chemist friend who is just a master in hops, and she's taught me a lot about this and that about hops. But one thing she taught me about 8 or 10 years ago was this thing called humulinones, and you have to not get it mistake with the hop compound. But humulinones are oxidized alpha acids, and we used to struggle with our BUs being kind of up and down, and I couldn't figure out what it was until I learned about humulinones. And there's humulones, which are an oil compound, but humulinones are oxidized alpha acids. And so here again, this is something where homebrewers have an advantage because you can more easily seal your bags of hops. If you have a vacuum sealer, maybe a kitchen vacuum sealer that you can use and then seal your hops up and then put them back in the freezer, you can reduce that oxidation, because those humulinones are bittering compounds in hops. But the thing is that one BU of isomerized alpha acid isn't 1 BU of a humulinone. So a humulinone is about 0.65 to 0.7 times as bitter as an isomerized alpha acid. And the reason why this has become a big deal in the last few years is that as breweries have pushed their dry hop loads up to way past 2 pounds per barrel, 3, 4, 5 pounds per barrel, they're adding more and more of these oxidized alpha acids to their beer, and they're contributing bitterness to the beer. So that's how some of these breweries and home brewers, for that matter, that aren't adding any bittering addition at the beginning of the boil, it's humulinones that are contributing the bitterness to the beer. And so it's a really cool way to add bitterness, and it's a drier, like what I would call perceived bitterness. It's not as sharp of a bitterness. I like a mix of bitterness from isomerized alpha acids as well as from humulinones. But if your hops are just sitting, if you open a bag of hops and you roll it up and you tape it up, and even if you put it in your freezer, you are still going to get some oxidation, and your alpha acids are going to oxidize to humulinones, and you're going to end up with a different bitterness. It's not necessarily a bad bitterness. I only bring it up just so that you know about it and you understand what humulinones are. But it also explains why, if you talk to a hop chemist and you ask a hop chemist, is the International Bittering Unit measurement still viable and pertinent today? They'll tell you it's not. It's only pertinent as a marker to say that, okay, I hit a number on my recipe and it's the same as last time. But the fact is that because there's so many humulinones and IPAs these days, because of the heavy dry hop load, and because a humulinone is only 0.6 or 0.7 times as bitter as an isomerized alpha acid, a spectrophotometer that measures BUs can't tell the difference. And so you have to move to what's called an HPLC, a high performance liquid chromatography, to actually measure BUs in a true format in today's day and age of IPA. We don't even have an HPLC, so it's not even something we measure for, and most labs can't even measure for it. But it is something to keep in the back of your mind of how you're going to store your hops, going back to my last slide about freezing your hops and having them stored ultra cold. Biotransformation is something that we've spent a lot of time on over the last couple of years. You hear a lot of hazy IPA brewers talking about it, and that's an interaction between the yeast, and specifically an enzyme that's in not all yeast, but some yeast. It's an enzyme called beta-glucosidase, and the beta-glucosidase enzyme can work with certain bound and unbound hop compounds, and some of them being thiols, and other of them are just the more conventional hop aromatic compounds, and they can convert one hop compound into another. So for instance, like linalool can be, or geraniol can be converted into citronellol, and there's certain paths that they can take, and off the top of my head I don't remember all of them specifically, but biotransformation is simply where your yeast is helping trigger a flavor change in a hop. And so again, most hops have bound and unbound compounds in them, and so some of them are more easily converted, some of them will just stay in their normal format, while others can convert from one format to the other, from one oil to the other, if you will, and create more interesting and in-depth flavors in your beer. So if like we use California ale yeast for most of our beers, and that doesn't have as much of a biotransformation component to it, so it doesn't have as much of the beta-glucosidase enzyme, but we have seen it work successfully in our double dry hop Pliny, and previous to that Pliny for President, and we use this in a few other beers as well. Where it's really popular is on hazy IPAs, where hops are being added at, it's like 3 days into fermentation, which is what we do for our double dry hop Pliny the Elder. And so you add your dry hops in the middle of fermentation, and you can actually trigger these amazing, really soft and subtle changes to your hop profile. Another approach is to load up your whirlpool with a specific hop variety. So like Sabro, which I mentioned earlier, was pretty polarizing. Well, Sabro is just packed full of geraniol, and so geraniol can convert, I think it's to citronellol, if I remember correctly. Don't hold me to that, but there's a conversion that can happen there. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen by adding dry hops in mid fermentation, but it does work. Something that I didn't add to the list is what we call cool pool, and here something else really hard for a professional brewer to do, but really easy for a home brewer to do. We will often high gravity brew our beer. So at our use our Windsor brewery for example, we can we'll normally take 85 barrels of wort to the kettle before we start the boil, and it'll boil down, and with losses we should go to the fermenter with 75 barrels of cold wort in the fermenter. So we'll lose about 10 barrels of wort on an IPA, and a lot of that's lost to hops and this and that. So with the cool pool, instead of taking 85 barrels to the kettle, we may only take 79 barrels to the kettle with the same amount of malt as if it was 85 barrels to the kettle, and will then be high gravity brewing, basically making a more concentrated version of, let's say, happy hops. And then at the whirlpool, we'll have sent in 6 barrels of water or 5 barrels of water, whatever it is. And it's cold brewing water. And then when we pump the hot wort in, that cold water brings the temperature of the hot wort down to 180, 185 degrees. And we call that the cool pool effect, or that's the term in the industry. And so essentially you're cooling your wort down in your whirlpool. So when you make that final hop addition, your temperature is 10, 20 degrees cooler than it normally would be. And so you can gain a lot more aromatic compounds and positive aromas by having a cooler temperature. Instead of being at, say, 205, you can be at 180, 185. And so the volatile hop aromas won't be volatilizing off as quickly. And then finally, hop creep. This is something that came up probably 8-10 years ago, and everyone thought it was a new phenomenon. And the fact is, it was actually something that was written about in the late 1800s in England, except back then they called it the freshening power of hops. You know how they call it dry hopping? No one ever knew what that was. Well, this explains it. Dry hopping was called dry hopping because the English brewers, when they were shipping their beer to India, would dry hop, and the beer was, or it doesn't even have to be that they were shipping it to India. They could have been in the tanks in their brewery. They were seeing a secondary fermentation, and the beer was drying out some more, and it was continuing to ferment. And so that is now what is called hop creep. And what we've recently learned, mostly through Tom Shellhammer up at Oregon State University, is that hops have enzymes in them. And so those hops are causing a secondary fermentation. Now, it begs the question, why now, and why didn't it happen before? Well, one thing is that kiln temperatures have come down. So most hops that you get, whether it's home brewer or professional brewer, have been kilned at 125 to 130, maybe 135 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas 10 years ago and beyond, hops were kilned at 140 to 160. So they were much warmer, and so they were the enzymes in the hops were being denatured, so we probably just didn't see it as much. Second to that is we're just adding a lot more hops to our beer these days compared to even 10 years ago. And so just the sheer quantity of hops that are going into the dry hop is causing the secondary fermentation. And so why is this a problem? Well, it's for a professional brewer, it's changing the specs of our beer. If our beer is supposed to finish at 2.5 Plato, say, so 1.010 specific gravity, if it's continuing to ferment, it can ferment as much as a 0.5 degree Plato. So it could take that 1010 specific gravity down to 1.008. And if it's in the bottle now, or can, that's causing too much pressure in the can or bottle or keg for that matter. And so the other big issue is that, as you all know, fermentation creates diacetyl. And so a lot of breweries are experiencing a secondary fermentation in the fermenter, and our beers are going diacetyl. And now we have to wait for another week, sometimes 2 weeks, to let that secondary fermentation complete before we can crash the temperature and make the beer cold. So hop creep is a problem for everyone that dry hops over a pound per barrel. We see it on Blind Pig even at a pound per barrel. We don't tend to see it on half a pound per barrel beers, or we see it less. And so that's where the T45 cryo hops come in, because if you're dry hopping with all T45 cryo hops, if you normally dry hop at 2 pound per barrel, you can dry hop at 1 pound per barrel using all cryo hops. And because they're concentrated hops. So it's really and then getting the hops, the hop material, the green hop matter off the beer and dump it, that also has helped reduce our dry hop time. Yeast health is a big deal also. If you know, what we've pinpointed a lot of hop creep to is as much about yeast as it is hops. And so yeast health, we've got you know, we're adding zinc as a yeast nutrient. There's also servomyces, which is a mix of zinc and dead yeast cells, and there's yeast X, which is another yeast nutrient. Using yeast nutrient to have healthy yeast, even if it's your first pitch, is really important to help reduce hop creep. So so that is the end of my presentation. I appreciate you listening. I think I went a little bit long. Apologies again for the little hiccup with the internet, but thanks again. I'll take any questions.
Oh my goodness, Vinnie, that was so much good information on hops and hopping methods. I'm sure we must have some questions out there.
Yeah,
I've got a quick.
I'll go first. Sorry,
Patrick.
Sean. You mentioned hazy IPAs, and there's a lot of debate about hazy IPAs, and some people call it lazy brewing, and you know, people throwing all kinds of nonsense into their IPAs to get it hazy. I guess I don't have a specific question, but what's your opinion of it? I suppose.
Yeah, it's an interesting. I'm happy that, so we do make a hazy IPA. It's called Mind Circus. We're probably the only brewery that bottles our hazy IPA. There you go. Todd's drinking it right there. We do can ours, but we only sell the cans at the brewery. We're still a bottle focused brewery, thankfully. Yep. And so, and I'll go off on a little tangent there and get back to your question, but bottles always will have lower total package oxygen compared to cans. Any brewer that tells you that their cans have as low of oxygen, the only breweries that can probably say that are, you know, the big industrial breweries, maybe Sierra Nevada, Firestone Walker, Bell's, New Belgium, those type of breweries, Deschutes. But any small brewery, no, there isn't any way that you can have as low of a oxygen TPO, total package oxygen, in your cans as you can bottles. It's just pure simplicity that the opening on the top of the can is much larger than the opening on the top of the bottle, and the way that you have to apply the lid. So anyways, I'll get off my soapbox because I held out long enough, and Natalie browbeat me enough to start canning. But back to the question about hazy IPA. Yeah, there was definitely a lot of talk early on that that, you know, hazy IPA brewers were just lazy and whatnot. And you know, the early hazy IPAs were from Hill Farmstead, you know, Sean Hill at Hill Farmstead, John and Jen at Alchemist, and, you know, so up in the Northeast, which is obviously why it was called New England. You know, I know Sean Hill pretty well. We're pretty close friends, and I guarantee he's not a lazy brewer. That guy is one of the best brewers I know, and I really love the beers he makes. I think early on, hazy IPAs were misunderstood, and that they just didn't know what they were doing. And, you know, it's a pain in the ass to make a hazy IPA. It's really hard, and we struggled for years with Mind Circus, and we've only made it for 3 years now, maybe 4 years. And I would say only in the last 12 months have we got to the point where I feel confident and comfortable that Mind Circus will be hazy. And it still keeps me up at night. I stress more about that beer than anything else because people expect a haze. But when things are working right, what causes the haze is an interaction between the proteins in the beer and the polyphenols, and it can also be pH focused as well. And that's why dry hopping early on, if you're trying to make a hazy IPA, it's why dry hopping early on in fermentation helps, because as you all probably know, fermentation makes the pH drop. And so you will get the hop polyphenols bind better with the proteins that's in your wort that's fermenting to beer at a slightly higher pH. And so that's one reason why dry hopping early. Now, if you're a professional brewer, it sucks because you want to try to reuse that yeast. I know some breweries that only use dry yeast, dry New England IPA yeast to make a hazy IPA. But in short, that's the interaction between, but to make the haze be permanent. That makes permanent haze. So then the front end of that is your malt bill going heavy on high protein. So wheat and oats are the typical way to go. And but also if you don't want to go too far over because you can then add too much. So we use the rule of about 12 to 15% wheat, and then maybe like 5 to 10% of oats. And oats can be a pain in the ass because they just stick up your lauter ton. So it's not a bad idea to get some rice hulls if you have that issue. There's also now malted oats, which are nice. The malted oats are nice, but they're sure fermentable and they make your beer really dry. Oftentimes brewers will use a heavy load of calcium chloride in their hazy IPAs to add body and that sweetness and that big mouth feel. To me, most breweries are using too much calcium chloride, and it's just making it too chalky and almost aspirin-like tasting. So, I still, something I'm proud of with Mind Circ is that it still has a pretty snappy bitterness to it. But our bartenders here all the time, well, in normal times when we're open normally, our bartenders say, your hazy IPA Mind Circ doesn't taste like any of the other ones out there. And I wear that like a badge of honor. And most of the time, these people don't reorder it because they want something sweet and big and full, but that's just not how I like to do it. And I'll say one last thing about hazy IPAs. Like they got like brewers that, I won't say any names, but brewers that were the most vocal. There are brewers out there that were so vocal about how hazy IPA brewers were lazy. And all these brewers are now making a hazy IPA. I wasn't planning on making it. And then a buddy of mine who's a bar manager, he challenged me. He's like, I want to see what a Russian River hazy IPA will taste like. And so our first hazy IPA wasn't Mind Circus. It was this beer called Tempo Change that we make every once in a while. That's a hazy IPA. So anyways.
Vinnie, I have a question for you about
I have a question.
The original blind pig. And I can recall when I first had blind pig and I went to a restaurant, and I'm not kidding you, the waitress warned me away from the beer, said, it's just so bitter, you're not going to like this beer. And I ordered it anyways. And it was, and it was real bitter, at least for my palate at the time, but I loved it. It was really good, but it was very bitter. Yeah. And now when I try blind pig, it doesn't taste so bitter. So is it me that's changed over time, or has blind pig changed over time?
It is less bitter now than it was back in the original version. We measure it at about 68 BUs. And again, this is just straight bittering units on our spectrophotometer, not going into all the fluffy details that I mentioned about humulinones and HPLC. And back in the day, it was 92 BUs. I would send it off to a lab every once in a while. The inaugural ale and anniversary beer would clock in at 120 BUs. Natalie and I just rebrewed the inaugural ale on our new pilot brewery, and followed the recipe to a T, but with modern equipment. And I could only get it to like 80 BUs or something like that. I don't know how we got it so bitter back in the day. I almost wonder if it was the inefficiency of the equipment and we just had to put loads and loads of hops in. But yeah, it was mightily bitter back in the day. And it was Sam Shamus from Livewire, the bar down on El Cajon Boulevard, El Cajon in Alabama, and he was the one that said it was like licking the rust off a tin can, and that was our very first account in San Diego was Livewire. So, and second was O'Brien's, so famous beer bar, of course. But I also think, I mean, I came up with this idea of the lupulin threshold shift, and it was this, like fun little definition of, once hoppy beer now seems pedestrian when a double IPA isn't enough, you need to drink a triple IPA. That was based, I mean, in my concept in my head, it was based on both bitterness and flavor and aroma. But in the day, everything was so bitterness focused. I mean, like Stone made just some of the most like full bitter over the top beers, and I don't say that in a bad way. That was just like the era that we were in, and I would sometimes be a little ashamed, like, geez, my IPAs aren't as bitter as these guys, but I always just made what I like to drink. So
I have a question about HBC 438.
Yeah, Sabro.
So back then, yeah, NHC 2015 or 2016, I think it was. You came to NHC, had a seminar about HBC 438, and that Ron Mexico beer was, very memorable. That beer is awesome. So that's now Sabro, right?
It's exactly it.
How has Sabro changed from the original HBC 438? I know some brewers are complaining about some onion and garlic character. I don't know, maybe that's just a function of when it's being harvested, but how has Sabro changed from HBC 438?
Yeah, so I've been super lucky. Jason Peralt, who bred Sabro, he and I knew each other through my hop salesperson back in 2004, through the whole time at Corbel, Gerard Lemons, and he would bring me these experimental hops. So what ended up being a Tannum, Warrior, Simcoe, several others, and that's how I met Jason, but I didn't know him directly. And then years later, now we've become very close friends. And I've been very fortunate to be like, one of the first brewers. I was one of the first brewers to touch Simcoe, first brewer to touch Mosaic, first, it's 369, first brewer to touch commercially Sabro, and Sabro was an idea when you're talking about that homebrew convention down at the Town and Country there at at Highway 8 and 163. The idea was that Jason said to me, I've always wanted to release a hop to homebrewers first, and so this hop, which they called Ron Mexico for fun, which now is politically incorrect, so that's why we don't make that beer anymore. But it was this hop that just stuck out to them, and it was this like rank hop that was in the Single Hill field, and Jason just kept coming back to it, and so when he pitched this idea, I brew a batch commercially, and then you guys can bag up a little, I call it a dime bag of hops, a little 2-ounce bag of 438, and give it away. And then I'll make a commercial beer, and then Kyle Van Evenhoven from Yakima Chief can make a homebrewed version, because he was technically the first one to brew with it. You can talk about hop breeding, and that's how that whole thing came to be. And so it's always been very polarizing. Like, it's got this big over the top like pina colada, coconut. I get more mint out of it, and like over the top mint. But if you let that hop age out in your beer, that mint becomes sage. And I've never smelled a hop that smells and tastes like sage before. And like, I personally, it's become too polarizing for me. And so when we use it, we just use it in very small amounts. If I could capture that sage note when it's months old, I would use it every day. The problem is that the consumer looks at the bottle or can and says, "Oh, it's 3 months old. It must not be good anymore." And I'll admit, I'm probably the person to blame for that because of the way we marketed Pliny early: drink fresh, do not age, blah blah blah. I mean, that's all how consumers look at IPAs now. So Sabro hasn't changed that much, interestingly, but the problem is when you mention onion garlic, it's because they too quickly. And if I don't, if I mean, if Jason was here, I would tell him the same thing. They've expanded every new hop variety that has exploded, whether it's here in America or abroad, whether it's Galaxy in Australia, Nelson in New Zealand, you know, Simcoe, Amarillo. I mean, I remember when you could hardly find Amarillo that wasn't onion garlic because it was just being expanded so fast. Citra, Mosaic, they've all gone through this period, and thankfully now with like Amarillo, they're pulling back. There's less acreage now than there was a couple years ago. That's actually good for us brewers, home brewers, commercial brewers, whatever it is. So I don't think Sabro has actually changed that much. I just think that it's grown so fast, and they just, the picking window. Let me talk for a second about picking window. Every hop has a picking window, and Natalie and I go up and do hop selection every year, and we actually stay on the farm at Loftus. We stay in their old ranch house. It's really cool because like we're in it the whole time. Every 20 minutes, a truck goes rumbling by with all the hop binds that they pick the hops on to go dump them in a field. It's not the most restful place, but you smell hops 24 hours a day, and you sleep really well because of that. But they were always harvesting Citra and Mosaic. And it was interesting because the window got bigger and bigger and bigger. Well, every hop has a picking window. And so a hop grower needs to really be focused on what are they going to grow. If you're only going to grow Mosaic and Citra, you screwed yourself because they have the exact same picking window. You can maybe grow a little bit of both. So a hop grower wants to stagger what they grow. So maybe they start with an early variety, and then they have an early, middle, and then usually high alphas are last. And so Simcoe has a 10-day picking window. If you select Simcoe early, it's going to have more grapefruit notes. If you pick it in the middle, it's going to be more pine. And if you pick it up towards the end of that 10 days, it's going to be pungent. Well, that used to be an 8-day picking window, and then it was 10, and now it's 12 and like 14 days. It's gotten bigger, and now it's starting to shrink down again. So Simcoes are probably getting better again for everyone because the picking window is smaller. Citra, picking window is getting bigger. And so I never select late harvested Simcoe. As a professional brewer, knowing the picking window of a specific hop variety is really important when you're going to select hops.
I have a question. Thank you. I mean, you make so many great beers that I really enjoy. Not only the hoppy beers, but one of the beers that I was really impressed by, and I don't recall exactly the flavor of it, but it was called Dribble Belt.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so Dribble Belt is our quote unquote session IPA, but I hate the term session IPA. I know you're never supposed to say hate. That's what my mom taught me. So I strongly dislike. So I call it like a low gravity, like session hoppy beer or whatever, but really it's a session IPA. And so that is a 4.5% alcohol beer. If you remember in the middle of my presentation, I talked about best pale malt and using malt as a foundation to set your hops on. If you use standard 2-row malt that's got a color of like 2 or 2.1, it's like your basic 2-row Great Western or RAR. You're gonna end up with an okay beer, but you're most likely gonna have a beer that's really green from a hop flavor. So on Dribble Belt, like 70% of the base malt is best pale. So I'm using an English pale ale malt that's got a color of 3.5. Because remember, color isn't indicative of I mean, it's when it comes to kilning hops or kilning malt, excuse me, if you're lighter in color, you're going to have less malt flavor. And so you really do need to have malt that's a little bit darker in color as your base malt. I'm not saying Munich per se, but just like an English pale ale malt, if you want to get a little more malt backbone and flavor. And so that's what we do with Dribble Belt. It's like 70% of the base malt is is best pale. And then that gives us this bigger foundation to build the hops upon that are going into it to make this quote unquote session IPA. And so we can make a 4.5% alcohol beer that's really full. The problem here is when you want to add body and mouthfeel, and I didn't touch on this when I was talking about hop creep, is that that's the problem with carapils. I kind of snickered and made a backhanded remark about carapils, which is dextrin unfermentable malt. And the problem with carapils in this day and age of hop creep is that that's an unfermentable sugar. That's a long chain unfermentable sugar that carapils or dextrin malt is contributing. And so in doing so, you're adding sweetness and body and mouthfeel. But the problem is when you're leaving those sugars and you dry hop at a heavy load, now the enzymes in the hops are going to go and break down those long chain sugars. And then that residual yeast that's left in your beer is, now that those long chain sugars have been cut down, now they're in the long chain format, they weren't fermentable by your yeast, California ale yeast or whatever you use. Now that the enzymes have chomped them down and made them smaller, your yeast that's still hanging out in your vessel is going to start eating those long chain sugars, and it's going to start that secondary fermentation. And if your yeast isn't healthy at that point, which it oftentimes isn't, it's going to start kicking out a lot of diacetyl, and it's going to start spitting it out, and it's going to make it worse. And then now you're waiting longer and longer and longer for the fresh yeast, the good yeast, to absorb the diacetyl, the VDK, back up, so that you can get to a point when you're to where you can crash your beer or bottle it or keg it. So one thing I forgot to mention about hop creep is that we have a fancy piece of equipment called the gas chromatograph, or GC, that we can measure VDK. That's like an $80,000 piece of equipment. I have the best wife in the world and business partner, because when I told her what I wanted to buy a couple years ago, she understood exactly why we wanted it, why I needed it, because we needed to measure it. But there's also a simple way to measure, to figure out if your hop creep is done. So if any of you have ever made an IPA and it tastes great out of your fermenter, and then you bottle it or keg it, and then a couple weeks or a month later it tastes diacetyl, that's hop creep. And so what you need to do is, if you're dry hopping, you need to pull a sample towards, and if you can go 2 days in a row without the gravity changing, let's say you dry hop it and you're at 1.010, your 1010's final gravity, and it ferments down to 1.008 via hop creep. If you can stay for 2 days in a row at 1.008, which is 2 Plato, hop creep is done. And so that is a simple way to see it, to know that it's done. So if you dry hop cold and your beer is going to be kept cold the whole time, you don't have to worry about hop creep, because the enzymes won't work at the cold temperature.
So my original question
was, how successful was the younger this year, and do you see any changes going forward with younger?
Yeah, so that was it turned into a very difficult year. We because of COVID, we didn't have our normal in-person release. We didn't ship kegs anywhere, because at the time when we brewed the 2021 younger, California was shut down completely. And so if we would have known that Newsom was going to open part of the state back up for outdoor dining, we would have at least done some kegs, because it would have been great to support some of our accounts that have been really struggling. So we decided to make 8,000 mix packs of 2 youngers, or was it, 4 youngers, and then 8 other bottles of beer, 2 of each of 4 beers. And so we had 8,000 of these mix packs to sell. And in the end, we had 110,000 people at the doorstep of our website on January 28th, I think was the date. Quite honestly, it turned into a shit show. It was a pain in the ass. We got beat up on social media. It was incredible, some of the things that some of the people were writing to us. Within, we sold all 8,000 mix packs in 5 minutes. So on the surface, it looks very good. we were getting lots of texts and emails from friends, you know, virtual high fives. But the fact is, you know, I had our IT director point the info out to my computer, and for 4 days, all I did was respond to people, and a couple of our other team took all the social media. You know, in essence, Pliny the Younger turned into this national release, because if you knew someone in California, you could ship it there, and then they could turn around and ship it to you, whether you lived in Nebraska, New Jersey, wherever, where we can't ship legally out of state, private person could. So going forward, yeah, we had already said before the online release that we wouldn't do this again. It was a one-time deal. Next year, we'll go back to our traditional, you know, release at both breweries, and selling kegs to some of our favorite and best choice accounts. And so that's how it'll go. You know, interestingly, and I find this very ironic, because we're in the middle of a pandemic. I believe America was at about 450,000 deaths when Younger was released. So pretty sobering number. And the biggest complaint was that our online platform basically didn't give you like a 10-minute window to finish your transaction. When it was in your cart, you had to finish your transaction. And at that point, it was just a race to however fast you got your order in, that our e-commerce company was processing the 8,000 orders. Ironically, the same system that our e-commerce company uses is exactly how it works with calvax.org, which is the COVID vaccination website. When you go on to Calvax, and if there's an appointment at your local vaccination center, you could have 100 people going for the same appointment, and it's in your basket, and it's whoever completes all their information first is the one that gets the appointment. So I know this because last week about 10 of our brewers got vaccinated, or 8 of our brewers got vaccinated, and it was all because our production manager was on the Calvax website for this one local site, and he was shooting them off to everyone. And at one point, you know, we had like 6 brewers going for the same one slot, and then it would whoever happened to finish it first. So our joke around the brewery is getting COVID vaccine is about the same as buying Pliny the Younger online.
Yes, it seems like there's a lot of similarities there.
So I shouldn't joke about it, but I mean, we're just trying to, we got through it, and you know, we're just hoping that, you know, everyone gets vaccinated, and next year we can get back to normal, and we can support all of our draft accounts all over the state that normally sell Younger, because there's a lot of struggling bars and restaurants out there. And like I know in San Diego, the scene is going to look completely different. You know, like probably 5 of our top 10 accounts aren't in business anymore. So it's sad. Wow. It's a bummer. So.
Yeah, it's tough out there, and yeah, everybody needs to get a vaccine. I'm waiting for my turn. A couple more questions, kids.
Yeah, no worries. I got time.
Yeah.
I have a question, Vinny. What temperature do you like to do your dry hop?
So we typically dry hop at 68 Fahrenheit, so 20 C. It's not everything, but for all of our IPAs, we dry hop it at 68. And we've messed around with some trials where we've dry hopped at 52, which will reduce hop creep because the enzymes are not as active. But we just haven't got the same hop aroma. And so it's not something we're pursuing, you know, on a big scale. Now that we have a little pilot brewery, we're going to mess around with it a little bit. I think the thing is that it's not that you can't dry hop cooler. If you know, for us, we're focused on hop creep. It's that Pliny, Blind Pig, Happy Hops, they all have an identity. And so you just can't go change it. Whereas, you know, if I was developing a new IPA right now, if I could create the dry hop platform around a cooler temperature, but we just haven't seen the impact we can't get the same impact at a cooler temperature than that we do on a warm dry hop.
Thank you.
And I will add, like, but for like we dry hop our Saison Robert, we dry hop that at 42 Fahrenheit. We do dry hop our Pilsner STS just a little bit. We dry hop that at 42. So anything that we just want a super, super soft, subtle dry hop aroma, we will dry hop cooler.
So Vinny, I got a quick question. So you answered my first question through Brian's question, but the cool pool. So when you're adding water to, cool down beer, do you have to boil it to get oxygen out? And I know you said you were doing the water with the grinding the malt.
Yeah, so we right now are using deaerated water, which is something you would, as a home brewer, you don't have access to, obviously. But deaerated water is basically water that's had the free oxygen removed. And you know how most breweries will use CO2 to flush a line out. Well, as breweries get bigger, they actually use deaerated water because you can pack the entire line with deaerated water. And it runs through a UV lamp, so it's sanitized. It's sanitary water and clean. And so that's what we have been using. Interestingly, I just met with our mechanical welding contractor about adding a hard pipe line, because right now we're just doing it with a hose into the top of the tank with a flow meter right there, but I want to make it a little more easy for our brewing team. So we're going to just use cold liquor water. The oxygen we don't worry about because it is a pretty small amount. We don't worry about it yet, I say, because we're going to test it with cold liquor water, which would still have oxygen in it. But if we find that we see some adverse effect, we would then go back to deaerated water. So as of right now, I can't answer the question whether it makes a difference. So we are using deaerated water, but it's only because it's the easier water source to get into the top of the whirlpool vessel. My goal is to be able to let our brewers walk down into the basement, open a valve, watch the flow meter. Oh, it's 5 barrels, close the valve, go up and send the wort in. So, to be continued, I think is the answer there. If I was doing it as a home brewer, I probably would boil the water, and then I would just throw the water in like a 1 gallon, water jug or whatever you have, and to cool it down, and then just have it there in your, in your fridge, or if you can get it even colder, that would be the way to go. But it's a really cool technique, no pun intended. And some brewers will go as low as 150. This technique, I think if I remember correctly, I first read about it from an Asian brewery like Sapporo or one of those breweries. Those Asian breweries are so technically minded. It's really cool. I'm not saying that they were the first to do it, but that was the first time I heard about it and read about it. And some of these, and now some of the American craft breweries are going as low as like 150. Now 180 is the mark for sanitation. So anything below 180, and now your beer might have the ability to have bacteria growing in it. So we've always stopped at 180, 185, but the fact is I'm not too worried about it. And I'm actually kind of curious to try something at a cooler temperature on our pilot brewery.
Thank you.
I have a question about the open fermenter. So what kind of qualities would you say you get from, let's say, making a Pilsner in an open fermenter compared to the normal conicals?
Yeah, so open top fermenters, one of the main cornerstones is that they're as wide as they are tall. So the tank geometry is what we'd call 1-to-1 ratio, whereas your normal vessel, like, think about it, stone or Ballast Point, and again, I'm not picking on them because we have similar tanks, that are like a 1-to-3 ratio. There was 1 time as wide by 3 times, and if you get to like New Belgium, Sierra Nevada, they're getting even taller. They're like a missile. But even at your average brew pub, those tanks are typically a 1-to-2 ratio, or a 1-to-2.5 ratio. So 1 times wide by 2 or 2.5 times tall, and so you have a lot more heat that is developed through that process. So fermentation makes heat; it's exothermic, and so through that process, you're creating much different ester and phenolic compounds, and and so by having an open top fermenter, you can really control those those qualities much better. You also have no lid on the tank, so there's no static pressure on the top of the tank. Yeast hates pressure. Yeast doesn't like alcohol. Everything that we do to yeast is like the worst thing you can do to it. She hates pressure. She hates alcohol. And so, you know, I actually wonder if one of the reasons we have hop creep so bad is that Pliny the Elder is like 70% of our production. We have to pull yeast from another batch of Pliny and keep carrying it forward for cereal pitching. And it's something that I'm thinking a lot about lately, is that maybe for us, the reason that hop creep is so bad is that our yeast is stressed because it keeps being pulled from an 8% beer. So anyway, so back to the open top fermenter. So without that static pressure, and then the other thing you have to think about is that and again, this doesn't affect homebrewers, another advantage for homebrewers over professional brewers, but even in a normal tank, every 6 feet of liquid is 1 psi of pressure, even if you have that vented to a bucket when it's fermenting. So we're creating a lot of pressure on the yeast, and so it just makes for yeast that's less healthy. So from a flavor standpoint, we end up with a much cleaner and softer tasting beer. And so there's all these little things we've done at our New Windsor facility, or newer Windsor Brewery, from the malt cleaning to remove the dust in the husk, to wet milling, to pumping the mash in from underneath, to the open top fermenters when we can use them. And granted, we're not doing everything through open tops, but say like our lager, like STS and Velvet Glow, those are 100%. We never run a lager or a Belgian beer through a closed top fermenter first. They all go through an open top fermenter first. So we put them in for a certain reason, because we know the clean flavor that we get from the beer, and we can control the ester profile better because we can blow off the heat more easily. They're glycol jacketed just like a regular tank, so we can control the temperature however we want. The rooms are pretty sanitary. They're 100% outside air, so the air passes through. There's a cooling unit up on the roof that passes through. It then goes through a HEPA filter, so the air is totally pure. And then if that's not enough, it goes through a UV lamp right before it enters the room. So the air is pretty sanitary. There's safety concerns though. So we've got CO2 detectors in each of our rooms. So we have 6 open top fermenters, 2 per room. So we have 3 rooms with 2 each in it. The HVAC system is connected directly to the CO2 detection equipment. And so there's always air flowing through the rooms, no matter what, even if the tanks are empty. And then if for some reason they got into a high level of CO2, the alarm would go off, sirens would be going off, and the fan would move up to a speed that's like twice the speed as what it normally is. That's never happened before. The flip side to that is if we have a power outage, we have a very strict policy of standard operating procedure of how we lock those rooms down. No one's allowed to go in there until the electric comes back on, because it could become a very dangerous room as well, because of all that CO2 that was built up in there if the electric went off.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, if you can find our YouTube page, there's a really cool YouTube video that Natalie took of time lapse of an open top fermenter of the yeast billowing out and down that slide and into the yeast collector. It's pretty cool.
It does sound cool.
Unless someone else has a question, I have another question. Oh gosh, do you follow like low oxygen, or at least monitor your hot side oxygen ingress, or employ techniques to reduce hot side oxygen?
Yeah, so we don't necessarily measure it batch in and batch out on the hot side. We do try to be as gentle as possible through things that I've talked about before. And there's certain places where it just doesn't work. The area on the hot side, and as homebrewers, you don't need to worry about it as much, is is thermal stress. And that's called the butyric acid index, the TBI index. It's a tongue twister. So the TBI index is basically a measure of thermal stress, and that starts as early as the malting process, and then the mashing process, and then your kettle boil. So the shorter you can make your kettle boil, because that's where you put your most thermal stress on, the better. And so, you know, if you can do your 90-minute boil and a 60-minute boil, do it in 60 minutes, because you're putting less thermal stress on your wort. Now, with that said, it typically happens at bigger breweries with higher pressure boilers, where, you know, we're having to, you know, send, like, if a brewery has to send like 3 bar of steam, you know, so 45 psi of steam to heat the wort up. So that was something that we had a heavy focus on when you buy a brew house from a German brew house manufacturer, like we did. That picture is our brew house from Zeeman in Bergstadt, Germany. Like, that's something they're just used to dealing with is TBI. And so when you spend millions of dollars on a brew house like this, you have like a handful of parameters that your performance acceptance test, or PAT, is based on. What the PAT is you pick 2 recipes, and those are your recipes that you test once the brew house is fully installed. And if you meet all of the 6 standards, you just make your final payment and you're done. And it's based on usually like 10% of your final payment. So, you know, when it's multiples of millions of dollars, 10% can be a lot. And so TBI was one of the PATs, the performance acceptance tests, that I put in. Zeeman didn't even flinch at it, because they knew they would beat it, and they did. And so we literally gained like 6 weeks of shelf life just by going with a German brew house. Wow. Because of that thermal stress, that reduced thermal stress. And one of the biggest ways that they do this is, and North American brew house manufacturers don't employ this technology, at least not that I'm aware of, is, you know how when you're homebrewing and you take your wort to the kettle and you turn on, you know, you're boiling for 60, 75, 90 minutes, and it's just boiling the whole time. Well, that's not how we boil anymore. We boil for 75 minutes, and it's on my radar to bring that down to 60 minutes, but we're actually only at boiling temperatures, so 212, for maybe 30 or 40 minutes. The rest of the time we're at 205 degrees, or what we call simmer. And so it goes through a program. And so we're only boiling enough to blow off the DMS, which we know is for 30 minutes. 30 minutes is your boiling time, that, you know, if you have a hard boil, you should be able to blow off all the DMS precursors. And so our boil program is this program. It's almost like a mash program. You know, let's say you're mashing and you want to mash in at, you know, 130, and then maybe you want to do a step to 140 and 150, and maybe you mash out at 172 or whatever. Well, we have a program in our kettle, except it's basically jumping between 205 and boiling at 212, and that's all to reduce thermal load.
Is it boiling then simmer then boil? Because I've seen some similar with the Krone system.
Yeah, Krones,
I think
GEA, Zeeman, Braucon, Rolec, all the main, Christian Schmidt, all the main German brewhouse manufacturers will have this built into their program. It's not just specific to Zeeman. I've just never seen it on an American brewhouse manufacturer. And but it's just a program to reduce that thermal stress on the beer. You know, it's hard enough making IPAs. And in America, you know, we're making beer. The malt that we buy to make our beers, whether it's home brewers or professional brewers, is really high in FAN, free amino nitrogen. And the only reason we need FAN is yeast nutrient. But as malt and hop barley growers and malt suppliers have tried to get more extract out of their malt, FAN has increased. Well, the problem is that FAN is a precursor for Strecker degradation, which is basically that cardboard oxidation flavor. And so we're doing anything we can. So we have that hanging out there, knowing that we're going to have some flavor oxidation. And then when you make a big beer like Pliny that you're adding more and more malt to, we're going to have more fan, which the leftover fan will eventually become a hindrance to us. And so anything we can do, like reducing this thermal stress to reduce our TBI number, we're going to do. But the malt that that we all use in America, our base malt, was really bred for the industrial brewers of America so that they could add all the adjuncts and still have all the right compounds to be able to get a fermentation to finish out, if that makes sense, because you're diluting it down. If you're an adjunct brewer, all these things that we're in excess of as a malt, all malt brewery, maybe all malt with a little bit of sugar going in, adjunct brewers that are adding 30 to 40% of adjuncts, corn, rice, whatever, they're diluting all those numbers down, so it comes down to be the right level for them. But for all malt brewers, we're at a disadvantage. It's better to buy European malt and English malt, because they're still mostly malting that to standards that are more for all malt brewers.
Are you requesting certain varieties, like telling the maltsters like don't add any Metcalf or something like that? Because I think Metcalf's pretty hot compared to some of the other ones.
Yeah, Metcalf is probably the most hot of all the malts, and there are definitely better malts than other. Metcalf is definitely probably of all the current varieties is the one we try to avoid. Coppola is good. Is that what it's called? Yeah. So, but we're not even at our level, we're making 40,000 barrels a year. It's a lot of beer, but we're not at a point where we can be like dictating too much of what we're going to get. But one of the reasons why I like our higher kiln base malt is that there's only a handful of us using it. And I know some of the other breweries that are using it, and they are big enough to move the needle with the malt company. So I know that, I'm like that. I'm like that leech on the back of the whale. That's, there's always these little, I don't know, they leeches or whatever on the back of the whale, and they're sucking blood or whatever out of the whale. That's kind of us as a malt purchaser. We're piggybacking on some bigger craft breweries that I know are dictating their malt supply better than I can, because even at 40,000 barrels, we don't have much say in what we're going to get. We can ask for this and that, and that's about as far as we can go. But we're not going to be able to say I want a specific malt to be at this exact color, and I need it to be at this protein level, and so on and so forth. And then you get to the really small, brew pub brewer that's maybe 1,000 or barrels or less. The average brewery in America is 600 barrels. They don't have any say in their malt. They're just getting whatever they get. So.
Well, this has been awesome, Vinnie. I'm going to have to say that we have one more question. I'm going to call it. Anybody got something?
I got something.
All right, Steve.
So you kind of you freaked me out when you said Simcoe changes in flavor depending on when it's harvested, early to late. And is that true with all hops? And as home brewers, we don't see that kind of information on the label. Is that something that will be added to the label soon?
Yeah, it's I know. Sorry if I freaked you out there, Steve, but it's true. I'll be honest with you. I didn't start going to Yakima until about 2003, 2004. In hindsight, I say that shamefully, but and I learned that early on as when we started selecting Simcoe, and I was like, holy crap. There's a difference between, 10, there's in this 10-day picking window. It's the same with every hop variety. There are some varieties that are less, like Cascade has this ability to just hang on the vine. It's not too susceptible to powdery mildew. It's got better, staying power, if you will. But I mean, the problem is that for a home brewer, and this is really unfortunate, but it also speaks to where you should buy your hops from. And if you can find a direct source from Yakima, and again, I don't want to like speak against the local homebrew shop, but the places that are closer to Yakima that have that connection, someone like More Beer, I mean, the amount of hops that More Beer buys is probably more than a small brewery does, and in a lot of cases. I'm not sure if More Beer does hop selection. They might. I actually have no idea. I've always meant to ask Chris Graham that, but yeah, you are at a bit of a disadvantage as a home brewer because there's a pecking order to hop selection. A lot of times it's a bit of a situation of like the first man to the moon, like who can get the Yakima the quickest to do hop selection. You'll always see Bell's, Odell, and Sierra Nevada there early. The problem with this is that as the breweries push to be there sooner and sooner, the pressure is put on the growers to harvest their hops sooner, and maybe they're not in the right picking window. Maybe they're harvesting Centennial a little bit earlier. Cascade used to be harvested way later than it is harvested now. It's only been moved up in a harvest window because it's flexible, but Cascade used to be harvested in the middle of September, and now it's harvested typically in early September. So, but yeah, to your question of will you see harvest date on your bag of hops you buy, probably not, because by the time I'm just being honest, sorry, but by the time the hops that you guys get as home brewers, it's most often a blend of multiple lots. And so it could be Cascade, or it could be Simcoe from 4 different farms, and it might even be from Oregon and Washington blended together. But hop selection is first man to the moon. It's about relationships. We buy about 50% of our hops direct from growers, and so the broker's not even there. The other 50% we buy from brokers, but we have very strong relationships. We tend to buy from the same farms every year. There is such a thing as terroir in hops. It's only starting to be talked about now, but it is one of the disadvantages of being a home brewer. But that's why I say, like, finding a source for your hops that you can trust. And one thing I would highly recommend, and it costs a little bit of money, but it's a West Coast thing. I mean, homebrewers, I'm always impressed when I go to the homebrew convention, the big national homebrew convention that the Brewers Association puts on. And homebrewers have, planned their vacation around going to the conference, and they're learning, and they're networking, and it's fun. It's really cool. I mean, I still love going to that and speaking at it after all these years. But I would suggest you look out, once the world gets back normal, for the Yakima Chief Hop and Brew School. And it's open to homebrewers and professional brewers alike. And I was at the very first hop school back in 2004 speaking at it, and I just spoke at it a couple years ago again. And it's a 2 or 3 day deep dive into the hop world up in Yakima, and going to these farms that are thousands of acres and seeing like the Taj Mahal of hop pickers at Peralt or Loftus. It's amazing, and it's a really cool experience, and you get to rub elbows with professional brewers and all the hop growers, and this is in the middle of their harvest, and yet they figure out a way to host you and bring you in for a tour and cook a barbecue, and it's a really cool experience. And if you really are into hops, I can't even stress enough how much I love Hop and Brew School. It's a really cool experience.
Sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Oh, thank you, Vinny.
All right. My goodness, what an awesome evening. I think folks need to grab a glass if they haven't already. I'm grabbing a glass of Blind Pig. I'm pouring it into my Pliny the Younger glass.
Were we supposed to be having beer this whole time?
Well, not you, Derek.
I have a splash left.
Okay, Derek, you can start drinking now.
Is Cora in bed?
Can I start with this?
Yes.
Look at that.
Yeah, you absolutely can. I'm going old school.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
new
I
old
got my
school.
younger.
As we
Nice.
found out tonight, has changed quite a bit over the years, which is what I kind of expected to hear. But
Well, it sounds like I've changed a bit over the years too, because it's a combination of, I think Blind Pig has changed, but it sounds like I've changed as well.
Andy, I'm sorry to say, but that is true. You changed what we all have. So
The lupulin shift. That's what we're talking about.
that in that respect as well, absolutely. So I'd like to propose a toast to one of my most favorite beer styles, the West Coast IPA, and to one of the OGs, one of the godfathers of the style, Vinnie Cilurzo. What an awesome evening.
Thank you, Vinny.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks, Vinny.
Thank you very
Cheers.
much. That was awesome.
Thanks. I enjoyed it. It was a good time. Do this again another time.
Thanks, Vinny.
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Good. And apologies if I went long. As Natalie says, I can talk ad nauseum about beer and hops and whatnot.
We loved it.
That's okay. It's okay with us.
That was
It was
awesome.
fun.
No problem.
I got to ask before I jump off here, because I actually have to be up pretty early to brew tomorrow. I'm brewing a Belgian single on our pilot brewery tomorrow.
Yeah.
When did
Nice.
the Society of Barley Engineers start up?
Andy?
Yeah, officially 1994.
Okay.
And so some of us were at the Southern California Homebrew Festival.
You're reading my mind, because I remember the club too.
Yeah.
And one of our brewers that works for us used to work at Society, and he asked me earlier why I was taking pictures of stuff to put in a slideshow, and I told him, and I know those guys, and I told him, I said, yeah, I remember them from the Homebrew festival, and so. That's
Well,
Yeah,
back when-
I mean, a small community. I remember Vinnie beer when it was Vinnie beer before
Yeah.
it was even, Blind Pig or
Yeah.
Temecula Brewing.
That was Natalie's godmother, who she lived with when Natalie and I
Yeah.
first met years ago. She came up with that, and someone made that label.
Yeah, and thank God you went in the beer direction and not the wine direction.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we wouldn't have all this great stuff here,
Well, wasn't one of the first Southern California homebrew festivals in your backyard?
told me.
First five were
five.
on
It
my
was on-
parents' property.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the Cilurzo property.
I'm working
absolutely.
on.
Yeah,
So
it
we
was,
were officially at the fifth one. And some of us were at the ones before then, but officially Society Barley Engineers was there serving
Yeah.
beer at the fifth one. We have the pictures to prove it.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was.
Those were really cool, because you had like Byron Birch, who was here from Santa Rosa, who's since passed away, and
Yep.
George Fix, just a legend among legends in homebrewing, and unfortunately he passed away way too early. But man, are his books still so relevant? And I met a lot of great people. Fred Eckhart, since passed, but just huge influences that I met through that homebrew festival, thankfully.
You had a big influence on that festival, and I think some of the things that we remember are, making sure that the festival wasn't focused on, this is going to be a competition for beer.
Yeah.
This is a place for us to enjoy each other's presence and enjoy the beer and share it with each other. And I think you really kind of laid the groundwork for that.
Yeah, I remember that. And I remember too, one year, some of the executive committee or whatever, your steering committee, wanted to bring in commercial breweries, and one year there was on my parents' property, and I didn't want that. I thought there should never be a competition, and there should have never been, like true commercial beer. Maybe if someone was going commercial as a home brewer, okay, showcase, but like, let's not do it like a festival. And I think there was one year where they brought in all these commercial breweries, and that was the only year, at least when I was involved. And do any of you remember Rhino Chaser, the beer?
I do.
Yeah, and the Rhino Chaser had this big old truck with this like fake 6-pack, and it was driving up the driveway. It hit all the trees and it broke the top of their Rhino Chaser display vehicle. I thought it was rather funny, but well, thank you all. I appreciate you having me, and I just again appreciate all the time, and thanks for the invite.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vinny.
Thanks, Vinny.
Good.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Vinny. Come back.
All right. Cheers. Stay safe.
Cheers.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Now we have social time for an hour, right? Sorry, I gotta go make some bread.
Whatever you
Great
want to do.
presentation. Good seeing you all.
So
Yeah.
question, does anybody know Vinnie Cilurzo, any relation to the old winery named Cilurzo Winery up in Temecula?
Yeah.
Yeah, were you
more-
not
Absolutely.
tonight?
Okay.
So the deal is that he was sort of the black sheep of the family. I mean, they were all into wine and he was into beer. And so he had his Vinny beer. But at the winery, he was able to hold these homebrew festivals at the winery for
They had a
beer.
big
And so
property up there on the top of the hill.
Oh yeah, I
and
know
at
it.
the time, there was no place for us to gather as homebrewers, across multiple clubs. Other than outside somebody's homebrew club, there was no place to gather. And so that was sort of the beginning of the gatherings of, cross club gatherings.
Well,
So it was a pretty amazing thing. And he was the one who really made that happen.
their hospitality at the winery was so amazing. There was even a sign on the door that said, if we're not here, come up to the house.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how they were. That's who they were.
Yeah.
Do you remember all the peacocks?
Yes. So that's the thing is so the one thing, I mean, you may not know this about peacocks, but when they're like at night, you're trying to sleep and you wake up in the middle of the morning and you hear this sound and it sounds like, babies are being tortured, and you're like, what is going on? Yeah. And what it is, it's just the peacocks, but you don't know that because you don't live with peacocks. But there's peacocks roaming around the property, and so the deal with the Cilurzo family is they allowed us to go there, and they just said, "Come out onto the property. You can all just camp out here. You can do whatever you want out here. So that way you can bring the beer out. You don't have to worry about getting home safely." And so that's what people did. They camped out there on the Cilurzo winery property. And we had the festival, which was a very rudimentary festival. I think Jack Ridley may have been there.
Yes, I remember parts of it. Just
yeah. That's good enough. Parts is good enough.
Little
I was there.
Fragment.
Yeah, so you were there.
That means he was really, really there if you can only remember parts of it.
But it was a very social event. And so the idea was that we're getting homebrewers together. And for some of us, it was the one time in every year that we would see all of our fellow homebrewers in all the other clubs. And so that's what really got us motivated, I think Jim will remember as we went through the years through, with the Southern California Homebrew Festival, is some of the best times that we ever had were just the social gatherings. Even the Friday nights that were not the kind of the official, festival programs and the speakers and the bands and all that kind of stuff, but the parts about the homebrewers getting together with other homebrewers and other clubs, just to, socialize and to talk about different homebrews and to share their works with each other. And that's what we enjoyed so much about it.
Yeah, before a bunch of assholes built like this whole primo display bar system of 24 taps and just changed the landscape of a homebrew festival forever.
Hey, we got published in Zymergy for that too, so And a lot of clubs were embarrassed into like, you know, our game in the process. So I think it helped everybody in the end, you know, because we forced them to you know, make better serving equipment because they had to keep up with the times.
It was okay for everybody except for when that 24 tap bar tried to take out my wife.
Yeah, that did happen. Yeah.
So that's a whole nother story.
So the pictures that we have, and Steve, you know this because you put some of these onto the, you know, back before the internet, when we used to have brews letters, and Steve Mack was designing the covers of the brews letters. One of the covers had us at the Cilurzo winery serving our beer there. And the deal was, is you showed up there and everybody got a brown table, you know, a 6-foot long brown table. And that's what you got. You know, you were issued that out and that's what you were going to serve on. And you stuck all your kegs underneath it and you taped the you know, the hoses with the picnic taps on the end, you taped those to the table so they wouldn't go flying off everywhere. And you served your beer as people came by. And that's what the state of the art was. And then when we moved over to what was the camp?
Skinner? Was it Skinner?
Skinner. When we moved over to Skinner, we had this sort of secret idea that we were going to up the game on this. And we built a system that had 24 taps onto it, where all of the kegs were hidden inside the system. And you could serve it 24 kegs out of the system. So it was unlike anything that ever happened. And you can imagine where, you know, since we didn't tell anybody we were doing that, we showed up with that system and everyone else showed up and said, give me my brown table, and put their kegs underneath their table tried to serve them from the picnic taps. And so here we were with this whole bar setup and they had all the picnic taps. And so it was kind of humorous. And that's one of the reasons why we got written up in Zymergy for that. And the next year, I kid you not, the next year, 95% of all of the clubs had a bar that they were serving stuff at. All kinds of different themes and styles to the bar. It was really cool because everybody used their creativity to come up with something really interesting and made it sort of a theme type of event at the serving. And it was a lot better, I think, in the end than us all serving our beer out of, below brown picnic tables.
Well, I remember, Andy, one time, let's see, it was Bill Sobieski and I hauled that brew system up that was stored at my house to the festival, and we're cruising up 15, and it was on a trailer on his truck, and all of a sudden the hitch comes loose from the back of his truck.
Oh.
And this trailer is whacking back and forth across the highway. We almost killed the thing before we even got there.
Yeah, I remember that. And
who else did you almost kill?
Well, man, there were cars like scattering all over the place.
I bet.
This thing was ready to go, and somehow we got it there. So whatever.
And we had wheels on it, but the wheels were undersized for the weight of the whole thing.
Yes,
and
they were.
It was just a lot easier for 6 guys to pick this thing up. Of course, when it had no kegs in it, to empty it took 6 guys to pick it up, and so we would just pick it up and put it where we needed it to go. But I think then the other story along with that bar was when we brought it back to Ray DeGangi's place, and he had a forklift to bring it up on, and so he used the forklift and it ended up toppling off the forklift and nearly killed Judy. So good thing Judy's still around with us. Because it went down in her direction. It's a good thing she's a runner, because otherwise she probably wouldn't have been able to escape from a certain doom.
The bar failed towards her because she's attractive.
That is correct.
Thank you, Jim.
I have a comment about Vinnie's presentation. I think what impresses me so much about what he said tonight was he was regularly referring to home brewers when he's talking about, professional
Yeah.
level stuff. And
Yeah.
he made those references to connect with us as home brewers, a dozen times or more. And that's
Yeah.
just so impressive.
You know what, Jack, I think that's not something he just made up. I mean, he started as a home brewer. He's a very avid home brewer. And so I think he has a heart for home brewers. And so I think that's not something that he developed in the process. That was where his roots came from.
Well, he's got to get up early tomorrow to brew on the pilot system.
Yeah, I'll tell you what I was
developing
impressed with about that presentation was I knew obviously Vinnie, he's a great brewer, not just of IPAs and sour beers, but other styles of beer. But just the level of detail he has on a lot of these subjects is just beyond what I had even expected. He's just really dug into the science that's going on behind some of these things and trying to understand everything. And so there's a lot of understanding that's gone into the development of the beers that he's done. And it's probably no surprise really that a beer that's been worked on for so long, like Pliny the Elder, is such an outstanding beer. It's not by accident. It's something that he's really worked on over a number of years, decades.
Yeah, absolutely. And he shared the whole evolution of it with us.
Yeah.
Blind Pig and Pliny the Elder.
Yeah.
And I feel, I don't know if you know this, that I kind of feel like a stalker of Vinnie Cilurzo. Okay. I have to admit this. Okay. So, obviously Don and I are running around Temecula trying to find his Blind Pig, brewery. Right. So, he moves up to,
by the way, Jack, just a quick comment on that. You guys said that you couldn't find his brewery and you kind of ran across it by accident. I had the exact same experience back in the day. I went there once, and when I went back to try and find him again, I couldn't find him worth the crap.
It was sort of hidden. That's why
it was the usual industrial. See you guys. But yeah, they were kind of hidden.
Yeah. It was, what they could afford. And, that's what happened. So, anyway, I moved to Northern California. Actually, before I even moved up here, I knew he moved to the Corbel, started Russian River at Corbel. So I would go there and drink champagne and wine, and I would bring home brew bottles up, and I would run around looking for them, and I couldn't find them. So I'd leave these bottles, next to some fermentation tank with a note. Okay. Jack was here. Okay. Be careful. Don't drink these beers. They're dangerous. Okay. And then, he followed him to the Russian River thing, so he knows me. He's kind of scared of me. Right.
Did he ever say anything about those beers, the Jack was here beers?
I think he said, don't do that anymore.
My lawyer says, don't do that anymore.
Yeah, I think that was it. But, and I met up here in Anderson Valley. I know he and, his wife, Natalie. So, I feel like, we've all kind of old timers like us have grown up with the Cilurzos, and it's been a great experience.
Well, after this presentation, I mean, if you look at the last HomebrewCon conference from 2020, I think we've picked up in the last year 6 or 7 of the presenters from that homebrew conference, because Vinnie was one of them, so all of these people, a lot of these presenters that have come to us, they presented at the last homebrew conference. So it's kind of interesting little fact.
Yeah. Technically, what Vinnie touched on, he touched on a lot of subjects, technically, and I'm going to have to review this presentation when it goes back online and try to pick up some of those tips, because there was a lot of learning that came out of this.
Yeah, we will be posting the recording as long as that came out okay from Andy, as well as we have this PowerPoint presentation as well.